Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and it's tier list time. It's been almost pretty close, a few months off, 3 years since I made the original tier list. I did do an updated video, but that was just to add the classes from Dark Archive. Now we have not only the Kineticist, but now Exemplar and Animist, and it's been a little bit over a month since they came out, so I feel like I've digested a lot of the information based on them. And so I figured let's give a updated tier list. And also I've just evolved as not only like a Pathfinder GM / player, but as a person in general. Now, if you have seen my original playlist, which I know a lot of you have, then you know that I was giving a whole number system and classes could, tier up based on a number. And then if you add all those numbers together, I would place them on the tier list. And I was contemplating doing that up until this point, and then I realized that that's all completely pointless, and it's just a lot of arbitrary numbers being thrown in based on what my view of objective is, and not necessarily what your perception of what is objectively true or not true is. So I'm going to be still rating the classes based on the 3 pillars of gameplay. So that's combat, roleplay, exploration. The 3 major things that happen in everyone's game session and can be categorized into those things beyond maybe, real player versus player combat. But that's kind of just more about how you are jacked versus how your friend is jacked. So, I don't know these things. I can't rate them. But I'm loosely going to base it on the 3 pillars. Now, again, as from the first video, this is from a viewpoint of all things are equal. So your group is participating in combat, roleplay, and exploration in equal measure. And when it comes to roleplay, specifically, since that's a little bit more objective, you could do anything with any of these classes. You could play very poorly or very well based on your own roleplay capability. What I'm going to be talking about today is what the class offers you as far as ideas / features, because some of the feats do give your character a lot of flavor. So no numbers, more vibes, and overall, just know that this is going to be very different for everyone. Obviously, it's very subjective, but more so because we're all not playing the same game. Your game is going to be vastly different than my game, probably in some very key ways. And not only that, but even if you are playing in a very combat-heavy game, the types of encounters your GM throws at you could be very different. For instance, if your GM is throwing more intricate types of combat with multiple layers and different areas and all kinds of environmental hazards, that's vastly different than how most dungeons are run for the various adventure paths. And while I have only gotten about a quarter of the adventure paths with actual experience in, I can generally guess they try to keep things easy so that people can easily do this for their friends. Adventure paths are more of a guide to how to run a campaign versus how to actually make a really good in-depth campaign. So when it comes to the combat part, at the very least, I'm going to be kind of basing it off of what adventure paths do. A lot of White Room combat, maybe a little bit of variety, maybe a little bit of elevation, difficult terrain, all that kind of stuff, but nothing crazy. So classes that are very tactically advantageous, probably not as beneficial, but they could be in your game. All this nonsense I've been talking about for the last 5 minutes is more or less just to say, this is my opinion. You're watching this because you want to see my opinion on the classes from my experience for doing Pathfinder content for the last 4 years and just my overall experience of being in the tabletop scene for over a couple decades now. So if that's what you want, that's what you're going to get. If that's not what you want, or if you disagree with anything I say here, that's completely fine, because everything I say is not going to be super relevant at your table. Got it? Good? All right. Have I scared you away? Have I told you that this list is nonsense and it's going to be different for everyone anyway? Yes. But do I care? No, because I feel like the better I explain it, the better you guys can take the information away from this tier list for your own games. because I do speak from a position of a lot of home games, a lot of public games, all kinds of stuff. So I know it's generally going to work in a lot of people's games. Also, Paizo just really does super well with a lot of their classes, and a lot of it is just going to be good. So this is not going to be a very exciting tier list. Maybe. We'll see. I think I've talked enough. Let's go ahead and get on with the tier list. So, 3 pillars of combat, roughly where they kind of average out. Like if a class is really, really good, like A tier and everything but one thing, and that one thing is S tier, I'll put it low S tier. But if it's like all A tier except for one thing that's D tier, then I'll probably be like a B tier. You know, I'm not going to put hard numbers on this because hard numbers are arbitrary and don't mean anything anyway. Done explaining? Got it. Alchemist. Let's start with that. Combat-wise, Alchemist is insanely good but very complicated. Bomber Alchemist has been buffed insanely with Player Core 2, making it able to pretty much hit any kind of enemy weakness that is not holy or unholy. And even then, there are technically ways they could hit that, but that's not until like late game. And that's not super relevant, so Alchemist combat capabilities are really good, but very hard to use. I would say that the Alchemist combat capabilities are very strong A tier. Not S, even though they're very capable of being S, depending on your playstyle, and there's a lot of alchemical items that can be used for other kinds of playstyles. It's mostly just due to how complicated it is, especially because unless you get certain items like the Spider Fang Injector that can let you use a mutagen when you start initiative, if you don't have that item, then mutagens become more difficult to use in combat. Though, speaking on like using alchemical items in combat, alchemists are also just better than spellcasters in a lot of ways because they don't have to worry about a prepared spell list. They can use all their alchemical items that are pretty much like spells because you use one action to make the item and then a second action to use it, whether that's to throw it or to consume it yourself. They don't have to worry about prepared spells or repertoire or anything like that. If they know the formula, they can always use it and always have access to it, which makes them very, very strong. But when you compare it to like single target DPS, they kind of suffer. So being very similar to casters with not quite the area potential, but not having the same single target potential that melees do, but the ability to hit so many weaknesses, it's all A tier, pretty much. Maybe a little bit verbose on that, but very much A tier for combat. Exploration. They are almost as good as most casters. Alchemist's exploration activities, they have a mutagen for literally every situation. The Spiderfoot Elixir allows you to just climb up on top of things. They can eventually read minds if they take certain feats with it. They're really good in a lot of different ways, though they are, as a class, that's very intelligence-based and maybe dex-based if you're trying to go bomber. They do suffer with some skill proficiency, especially if you're doing crafting. I don't know why they don't have the free upgrades to crafting like Inventor does. I really wish they would, because you're just going to be using some of your skill increases on crafting anyway. They're really good. They can do pretty much anything a caster can, maybe not to some of the same degrees, but a lot. So I'm going to give them A in that as well. And roleplay. Alchemist is very married to its idea of like elixirs and alchemical items, especially considering that most alchemical items, not all, but most, are elixir or some kind of like liquid in a vial, you know. So that does limit kind of how your character can do certain things. Some of the items can be reinterpreted, like the bottle lightning could be like a stone that is electrically like imbued or something like that. But they're very married to this idea, and a lot of their class features work generally off this, making the very like imagery of your character somewhat limited. Now, if you're a mutagenist, then you can kind of get away with a little bit more because you only need to pop out a vial to like drink it, or to drink and to like amp yourself up. Combine elixir can also, you know, make it where you're not just chugging a bunch of things at the same time, but you're just very, very, very married to the whole like alchemical item thing, which does limit how your character generally plays. It's interesting and it's definitely flavorful, But as far as like overall roleplay potential, beyond just being smart and having knowledge of alchemical items, the Alchemist doesn't really offer much for a player's narrative. So I'm going to mark that as a B. So overall, I'm going to say Alchemist is a mid-rank of A. Now, I do think if you have higher proficiency in the game overall, if you're a very smart player, strategic player, and you know how to work a lot of the items in the game, I think its combat would boost it up to S, and exploration can be easily modified with the use of a lot of archetypes to also probably be more on the S tier. So Alchemist, I think, very much ranges from mid A to low S. The roleplay thing, again, that's kind of just based on you more than the Alchemist, which is why it didn't rate nearly as high. All right, one of the new classes already, the Animists. Combat-wise, Animist doesn't really offer anything super unique in combat. They are interesting in the fact that they can use multiple traditions, kind of, at the same time, with a very more limited spell list for anything that's not divine. But their focus spells are very interesting, and they offer an interesting rotation mechanic, but they don't really feel particularly potent as a caster, I would say. So they are a caster overall. They're very good in a lot of situations, but not being able to single target, they're mostly relegated to supporting the team or to area damage whenever area damage is relevant. I'm going to mark their overall combat capability at the B, high B, low A range. It's just their focus spells aren't like Psychic's focus spells that are just really, really good. And they don't start with lay on hands like a champion does. That's also just really, really potent healing. They have a lot of decent magic effects for a lot of their focus spell potentials, but it ranges, and it also very much depends on what spirits you currently have like bound to yourself and what your active spirit currently can use. There's just a lot of variables, and so Animist isn't going to operate in combat the same. I will give them a special mention that they have one of the best Gish style or play styles in the game, with the Spirit of Ancient Battlefields giving probably one of the best caster options for martial combat. Really cool, but none of the rest of the class really synergizes with that. So, you know, like, you're just planning on using your own divine buffing spells. And buffing, while good, is only good if you have a prolonged encounter, which are somewhat rare in Pathfinder overall. So B, I feel, is very fair. Roleplay potential, or no, sorry, not roleplay, exploration. Exploration-wise, they're a caster. Divine being one of the worst overall, just because it doesn't offer as many of the unique options that, say, Primal or Arcane really has to offer. They are still a caster, and they still have some other spells that they can pick up through their spirits, though a lot of those are a lot more combat focused, not all of them. They're pretty flexible. I'm going to have to say A. Yeah. Being divine is a little bit of a hit, but the spirits can offer a lot of different options. If you homebrew in some different kinds of spirits too, that can also just change a lot of it. And I think overall A is just fair for most casters, as there's a lot of good buffing spells in the game that just let you go places you wouldn't normally be able to get to. Like, the casters are just so handy in exploration mode, and especially divine with its boosting capabilities can help in a lot of situations. So I'm going to say A, low A, high B, kind of again, but A more solidly. Roleplay, though, I think the Animist is really interesting, especially because you can consider the Animist to just be like a divine caster who gets a little spirit ally, and you don't even have to rotate your spirits to really make use of the idea of your character. Now, like Alchemist, they're very married to the idea of spirits and everything like that, but unlike Alchemist, who you're just a person who uses a lot of these kind of things, what you're doing as an Animist might vastly differ. Like, you might be someone who's trying to mediate some kind of event between spirits and humans. Very interesting. Maybe you're just some wacky kind of divine investigator going around with your spirit ally, having kind of like a buddy cop kind of deal. That can also be really interesting. These spirits add additional characters, which are ripe for all kinds of story shenanigans, which I think makes it really good. So overall, I'm going to rate them S. The spirits just have so much potential for roleplay, and even the spirits can give you different feels. Even though you're a divine caster, if you work with mostly nature spirits, that gives your character a more naturey kind of feel, which I think is really interesting and really cool. So I'm definitely going to rate it as an S overall, which puts it also in the middle of the A category, almost exactly. And Alchemist got 2 in the solid A and then 1 in the B. So I think Alchemist is just a little bit more A. So Alchemist is a little bit ahead of Animist. But overall, both pretty good classes. Barbarian. Do I need to say combat potential for Barbarian? They're really good, being the hardest hitters of any of the classes as far as like hit for hit damage. And on top of that, having just a base class HP of 12 is insanely good. The only class to do so. So even a Barbarian who's not completely focused on Constitution is likely to have the most HP in the party, even when you have a Kineticist, which is absolutely insane. Not only that, but they can just be really tanky. A lot of their feats can make them really tanky. Giant Instinct Barbarian is just one of the best ones, because what's better than a martial character who's really good at hitting hard, but one who has massive reach and can hit anyone anywhere is really good. So Barbarian, S in combat, very, very strong. Exploration, this is going to be a little bit of a hit, because unfortunately Barbarians, feat-wise, don't offer a lot of choices, and skill-wise, Barbarians mostly want to focus on strength-based skills. Granted, they have a whole feat line dedicated, a feat dedicated to using Intimidation, but Charisma is more of a tertiary stat. You're mostly going to be doing athletics things. I will say that unlike a fighter, Barbarian actually has the ability to break objects more easily than any other class. They get a lot of feats dedicated just to breaking things, which can be really handy in exploration mode, whether you're trying to break into a place, get into an important box or safe or something like that. Like, having someone who's really good at breaking things is really good. So I'm going to say that they are a B, but only because they can break things. Otherwise, they'd probably be in the C category, because they athletics is like their thing. That's about it. They don't do a lot outside of combat, and that's, other than what you choose to do with your build, but what the class does. No feats line up with it. The key stats don't really align with the use of skills or anything like that. So they're really just not meant for anything besides combat or breaking things. As a class, not as your character. Your character is a interpretation of these things. So because it's B doesn't make it bad, nor could it be higher for you. It's just not what the class leans into. Roleplay. So Barbarians are very tied to rage. Rage is just one of the key aspects of being a barbarian, but there's a lot of ways you can interpret rage, or you can interpret it as like a battle focus, or something where you just become super narrow and you hone in on a specific thing. I've seen so many different ways of it doing rage. I wish the instincts offer a little bit more, especially because they removed a lot of the anathema from them, only a few of them keeping their anathema now. And the instincts, while being interesting, none of your feats really do much with that other than give you more combat capabilities. The sheer amount of instincts, though, especially because there's like the whole elemental instinct barbarian, which is really cool, or the dragon instinct barbarian is really cool, really sets it in the A category for roleplay. You have a lot of options. Rage can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. Skills are not necessarily a really big choice for your character, and there's, again, rage is just a thing. Like, you're not just going to not use rage that often because you get almost all your feats for it. So your character is always kind of narratively doing some ragey base aspect, whether it's just like hyper focused or whatever. So, somewhat limiting, but I think with all the instincts and the different ways you can interpret, even you can interpret like raiders or strong, not military trained kind of people, I think is really good. So I'm going to give that an A for roleplay. So Barbarian with having S combat, B exploration, but A in their overall roleplay capabilities, is it's going to put them in middle A. And because they got an S, they kind of have a little bit of an edge on Animist. And actually, I think that puts them even above Alchemists, because I think Alchemist was AAB and Barbarian's SAB. So yeah, Barbarian hitting the top of the A category. As you can see here, a lot of the classes are generally pretty good, and that's just because Paizo just makes a very well-balanced game. When it comes to combat, every character tends to offer something. So most characters in the combat section are going to offer somewhere between S and B, and there's not many B combat characters, if I'm going to be honest. All right, Bard. Bard is one of the best buffers in the game. Courageous Anthem is just really good. They can maintain it. They get to use essentially what other spellcasters have to spend 2 actions to do as a 1 action and as an infinite cantrip. Also, Dirge of Doom, one of the best debuffs in the game because there's just no save. The enemy is just automatically Frightened 1, which just reduces everything they can do. Their 2 hit, their ability to be hit, even their saves, all reduced. It's very solid. So if you have a good support Bard, it's very good. They're also a caster, so they also are really good at like area attacks. And being occult casters, having a lot of really good debuff abilities, especially, makes them overall really, really good. Is their support potential S quality though, or A quality? That I think is a very interesting question. Because while Courageous Anthem is nice and just overall makes a party overall better, if you're playing with a bunch of players who are not necessarily combat focused, it's not going to make them combat focused characters. So as far as general class features, nothing of the Bard actually pushes the group above and beyond. They're really good to have, and a Bard augments the rest of the group to make them better, but that's their core feature. They improve the rest of their party, meaning that their combat capabilities are mostly tied to how well their party is able to use that, which is a little bit of a knock. So I'm going to put them in A. Really good buffers, very good to have on your team, but also very team-orientated to make use of most of their general features. So, I do think you could squeeze S out if you are very particular. Using Dirge of Doom with a variety of your save-based spells is very potent indeed, but that also requires a lot of action economy, which can make you incredibly vulnerable. So, you can do very potent things, but I think it's just not that great. So, well, it is good. It's just not like S level. So, A in combat. Exploration. They're a caster. They're really good in that. The occult spells, even particular, are really good at manipulating people, creating illusions, charming people, all kinds of things like that. It makes them really good in a lot of social-based situations. But when you go out of a city or when you don't have to talk to people necessarily, you're mostly used for like using distractions and stuff like that. So I'm going to say overall A. They're really good. They're a caster, actually, now that I think about it, they're also really, really good at a lot of social stuff, being a charisma-based class. And in addition to that, having like bardic lore with is it Polymath or Enigma? I'm not going to look it up right now, but one of those two, really good. Or just the ability to use performance for so many of their skill checks. Ooh, yeah, that's true. Being able to use performance for so many different, mostly charisma and talkie-based ones. That's really hard. I think A overall still. They're very good when you need to talk to people or when you need to distract people. They're very, very good in these very specific situations. And then the spell casting can kind of elevate that a little bit. So I would say upper A for sure, but not quite S. And roleplay. Bard is, I think, you can interpret Bard in a lot of different ways. The only real knock roleplay-wise against Bard is a lot of the negative culture that's been built around Bards, mostly, the horny Bard tropes, and the fact that they're a charisma-based class and very prone to drawing players who are very mischievous. So, you see a lot of Bards who play very, very similarly. And as far as class mechanic-wise, they don't actually have a lot of roleplay-based ones. A little bit now with the new Zoophonic one, making you more like animal-related. So there's a lot of variety. I'm gonna have to say A overall. I feel A, just because there's a lot of different ways. In your art can be different. You don't have to necessarily sing or use an instrument. You can do something like interpretive dance or all kinds of different things. I think that there's a lot of interesting ways to interpret Bard, but it's nasty subculture, well, part of its subculture anyway, and just the fact that a lot of people just have a very specific interpretation of what a Bard is, and the fact that being a charisma-based class, you kind of get shoehorned into specific roles like being the face, I think dampens its overall potential, which you probably could push to S if you were very much going with a more artistic look into the Bard, which I think is very interesting. So A overall. So Bard is solidly all A's, and that's really good. That's going to actually put them just above everything but Barbarian. Barbarian getting the slight edge because just having an S category is, I think, very potent. And even though they kind of have a relatively similar score, I think Barbarian just a little bit better. All right, Champion. Champion is really interesting, especially with the new changes in Player Core 2, removing the need to be a specific alignment, though you do need to follow specific edicts for your god and different kind of tenets as well. So they're very fun to play in a lot of different ways. Combat-wise, let's talk about combat. Combat-wise, Champion's probably one of the best support classes in the game inherently. Their ability to mitigate damage is outrageous. Just having a champion on your team improves your team's overall like survivability by a pretty hefty chunk. That with the ability to choose Lay on Hands, you don't have to choose Lay on Hands as your beginning spell now, is also very, very good. And they have so many different features that are just based on boosting up their team or boosting themselves up to make them more useful to their team in a lot of ways. I think they're incredibly potent. They have a very good play style that makes them want to intermix support and martial actions, especially being a lot more action-y than they used to be now in Player Core 2. I think really puts them up. I'm going to say Champion is overall S tier. It's very, very good in combat. Not great if you want to do damage, but great if you want to just make your team very, very hard to kill, and you want to be the reason why your team is hard to kill. It feels very, very good playing a Champion. Exploration. Champion suffers a lot in exploration. This is going to be the first C category, I'm pretty sure. They have some good reasons to have charisma and maybe a little bit of wisdom, depending. They have the narrative exploration benefit of being attached to certain gods, which can be useful, especially for gaining trust in your party in some kind of social engagements. So they do have a little bit of narrative edge there, but overall, skill-wise, they're another strength/dex-based class, much more leaning into strength because they have heavy armor proficiency and get legendary heavy armor proficiency, making them one of the tankiest characters in the game. But that over-reliance on strength definitely makes it harder for them to have more skill proficiencies, though they don't need to invest in Constitution as much as, say, like a Barbarian, because they just don't get hit or crit as often, and in addition to that, they just have a lot of healing and damage mitigation, mostly for their allies, but they have their own versions of damage mitigation as well. So they can kind of do a few other skill proficiencies if you want. You can build them in a lot of very interesting ways. It gives them a little bit of wiggle room, but as far as the class is concerned, not a lot of the class really leans into exploration, other than the fact that if you're playing a very pertinent god for a particular campaign, it can be really good. But most of the time, it's not going to be anything special. So unfortunately, Champion's going to get a C in its overall exploration capabilities. They just don't offer a lot when it comes to exploration. Roleplay. Roleplay is very interesting. Because of how they've changed the Champion, it's no longer necessarily like you're the lawful good paladin kind of stuff. You are no longer tied to certain alignments, so you're more able to roleplay in different ways. And depending on which god you are under and what edicts you follow, and even what kind of feats you select, can really change a lot of how your character is played. But the unfortunate thing is any character who's tied to like a specific god, that is what your character is mostly going to be about. You have to be about that in some way. Even if you're not like overly pious, even if you don't interact with your god or your faith that often, it still informs how your character gets their powers, and there's still the expectation from the deity that you're following their edicts and such like that. So while there are a lot of options for playing a champion, once you pick your options, you're kind of set in. It's very hard to move outside of that without going through a lot of effort. And some GMs are just not willing to put in a lot of effort just so you could change gods mid-campaign, especially if you're doing this in like society play or something like that. I don't even think you can do that in society play, actually. So yeah, it's something that it looks on the outside like they have a lot of options, but once you select what you're doing like from the get-go, the rest of the game is very much heavily dictated by those choices in the beginning, while a lot of other characters narratively have a lot more wiggle room they can do. They can be a lot more flexible with their narrative and their story. So I'm going to say overall A. I don't think it's bad for sure. I think it's really good. Don't get me wrong. Champions have a lot of very interesting options. And I wouldn't say B, because B just means that the class gives you nothing, which is not true. It gives you a lot. It's just you are very restricted. So what would normally, I think, be an S tier kind of brings it down to A. So we have an S, a C, and an A. And so that kind of drops it down roughly. It puts champion at the very end. You know, I'm going to put champion in upper B. I would normally say probably upper A, because that's kind of like when you even everything out, it mostly is like AAB, which would put them pretty much relatively at the end of B. But I feel like the restrictiveness on the roleplay, there's a lot of good arguments, I think, for putting champion in the top of B. But I say bottom of A is very valid as well. But just to make this list a little bit more interesting, put some things a little bit outside of the categories. Like compared to a lot of the others, this one suffers a bit more just because that C, there's something to mention about that C, even though it's similar to Animist in scoring wise, it's just a little bit, I think, worse off. And roleplay does mean a lot for me, so maybe it's just a bit of bias. B plus, A minus, somewhere in that range, I think both are pretty valid. All right, so we're five. Did I even say how many art classes there are? There are 25 classes in the game currently. That's insane. This is going to be a really long video. I'm sure you already know. But if you could do me a favor, leave a like or at least comment, agree, disagree. You know what? Even leave a dislike if you don't like my tier list or my reasoning or whatever. Anything helps the channel, but more specifically, Pathfinder 2nd Edition and role-playing TTRPG in general, because, you know, that's all I'm about. I've said it in so many videos, but I want more people to know about TTRPGs, and so the more the algorithm gets this kind of content, the better. So the more we interact, the better we do. It's just good. And if you like my takes, or you just want to see a lot of, you know, tabletop stuff I get early, you know, before normal release, then I recommend the subscribe. All right. I'm just going to start continuing on with the video now because it's going to be a long one and I can't really plug too much. Cleric, especially with the Battle Harbinger brought in, has me a little bit messed up. So, like, when it comes to combat capabilities, Cleric is the best healer in the game. The healing font and harmful font are, well, depending on the kind of party you're running, really, really good ways to keep your HP up. At like, they overheal more than they underheal. It is very hard to underheal as a cleric, which is really good. And because of that, they don't have to necessarily focus on healing. They can let their allies get really low before they just, bam, drop a big heal and pretty much reset the fight. So as far as combat is concerned, the fight isn't over until the cleric goes down. That is S tier if I've ever heard it. The cleric is incredibly important, and if you've played any kind of RPG, you know how terrible it is to go up against an enemy team that has a healer, and you have to kill that healer first. Not only that, but there's lots of ways that clerics can keep that healing potential while having an insane amount of tankiness. Just like War Priest in general is really good because you don't need to worry about your casting DCs or anything to heal people. You just heal people with an insane amount. So you could be a war priest, be hard to kill, and also can heal your team a lot. So Cleric's just S. It's just really, really good. Exploration. This Cleric suffers a lot. Cleric doesn't have the benefit that Animist does of being able to reach outside of their spell list a lot. Some gods do, yes, offer, and well, I think all gods offer spells outside the divine list. That's the whole point of their divine magic. But it's not a lot. It's very specific spells, and not a lot. Some of them are good for some types of exploration. You worship a god who is very like ocean-based, sea-based. You're going to get things like water breathing, all that kind of stuff. Very handy, but that's the one thing you're good at. So you have to choose the right campaign or choose the right god for the campaign. Doubly so for a lot of the domain spells. Domain spells are predominantly very, very combat focused, and so are not very helpful outside of combat. You're a divine caster, yes, but divine also doesn't have the most exploration-based activities. They're more focused on buffing, healing, and taking out demons, which, you know, is helpful, but that's more of a combat thing. So overall, exploration-wise, Cleric is going to get a definitive B. Now, roleplay. Battle Harbinger makes this one hard because Battle Harbinger completely changes what you can do as a cleric because you take battle creeds, you're no longer under a doctrine. It vastly changes how the cleric plays. And so there's a lot of variance. Not only that, but it's a lot of the same kind of arguments that Champion has. Though, while champions have gods as well, champions also have tenets that they have to do. They have a certain mission that they're on. Clerics really just have to follow their own edicts, giving them a little bit more wiggle room than the champion has. So I'm definitely going to say for many of the same reasons, but not the same restrictions, Cleric's definitely not S, but with the new ways you can play and everything, I think they're a very solid A. They're good. There's a lot of different gods. You can play very different characters. It's just you get locked into that style and that kind of idea when you make your character. So after that, narratively, you're always going to be tied into your god in some way or fashion. So definitely A, but not nearly as bad as Champion. So we have an S, a B, and an A. This puts them in the middle tier of the tier list. I'm going to say it's going to put them above Animist as well. Cleric, really, really good. Not quite as limited as Champion when it comes to roleplay and just being more combat potent, really, than the Animist with their healing font. Just puts them above Animist and probably arguably above Alchemist, honestly, as well. So, yeah. Just in the same kind of, does that put them above Cleric? I think that puts them above Bard as well. Having an S really does mean a lot. And so I think that suits them pretty well. They're very on par with Barbarian as far as like overall potential limitations. So yeah, Cleric and Barbarian, I think being tied, now it's just alphabetical more than anything. So yeah, I like that. I feel that's pretty particularly good. So yeah, we're off to there's a lot of A's, as you can see already. Let's talk about Druid. Druid's very interesting. So combat-wise, primal casting is insanely good. You have a lot of blasting spells. You have a lot of healing spells. It's very, very flexible. Though, I will say nothing in the Cleric or in the Druid specifically screams S to me. It's overall pretty competent. I would say it's very solid A tier combat. Having the ability to have an animal companion as a spellcaster, I think is also something worth mentioning as well. So I would say compared to other like A tier combat casters, pretty good, but overall, they don't have the healing potential of the Cleric. They don't have the damage potential or staying power potential of the Barbarian. I can't really put them really in that S tier category. And even Bard has the ability to be very, very handy with their buffs, while Druid is mostly just a caster anyway. So I'm going to say A, mostly for the primal spell list. If it wasn't for the primal spell list, it would probably be more on like the low A, high B, but primal spell list is really, really good. Exploration. They have so many abilities to transform, hide. When you transform into different creatures, it can give you stat boosts in particular skill sets, which is really, really good. Exploration-wise, as far as like magic is concerned, Primal is also really good with the ability of transforming. There's some healing and doing all kinds of stuff like that, while not having the same social capabilities as something like, say, the Bard has. They definitely have it everywhere else, which makes them very, very handy. So I'm going to say Druid definitely has S tier exploration. Casters are just inherently good in exploration, even though I say that and we already have 3 who didn't quite hit S tier, but that's because they have very specific spell lists, mostly divine. Primal, a lot better for exploration. So Primal is definitely putting it S tier for exploration. And now the roleplay. Now this one's very weird because the class does have very interesting options. Having an animal companion offers another character for you to interact with in the story, which is very good narratively speaking. The elemental ties are something that I think a lot of people really can tie themselves to. I think the overall biggest problem is the overall perspective on Druid. A lot of people think of Druid and they think of vines, they think of calling of animals. They don't really think of the primal aspects, and even if you do, it's very naturey, natural disastery, and not anything really other than that. So Druids are very like typecasted into being a very natural caster, which is kind of a part of their narrative. So you're when you play a Druid, you are very specifically a type of Druid. Now, with metal being more accessible to Druids now because metal is just an element, it has its own domain and everything, there are some interesting new choices with Druid, but I do think narratively speaking, even compared to something like the Champion, they're a little bit worse off just because of how people perceive them. They don't really offer anything other than the primal woodsy, got twigs in your hairstyle caster. And I feel like that's a very hard image to break. Again, while you are definitely capable of making a much more interesting druid than the general like perception, I feel like a lot of people are going to be drawn to a very specific type of druid or someone who just likes turning into animals anyway. So I'm going to give them a B, honestly, in their overall like roleplay potential. It's just something that I feel like a lot of people would struggle to make a super interesting and unique druid in comparison to some of the other classes. But that still puts them pretty much roughly in the A category overall. They got an A, S, and B, putting them middle of the A, right above the Alchemist and the Animist. So yeah, lots of A's so far. We're gonna have to see how this list goes. I promise it's not all A's. I definitely have some more fiery things to say, especially about Fighter. We're coming up to Fighter. All right, Exemplar. Exemplar is really interesting. Combat-wise, they're pretty good. A lot of their general features are pretty solid. As a combat class, like a martial class, I feel like they are pretty on par with a lot of the other martials, while not having quite the same wow factor that Barbarian or Fighter has. And they have a lot of ways you can play it. So they're a very interesting martial, but in a lot of ways, they're just a different kind of martial. They do have some interesting tankiness. It really depends on your icons. It's varied, very, very different person to person. So I'm going to say overall A, not quite as potent as some of the other classes, but they're still really, really good. Exploration wise, it's another strength/dex based class, but they do get a lot of interesting abilities to do other kinds of actions, which I actually think puts them above other martials in that way. And some of their interactions with being like a demigod or someone with some god infused power can be very plot relevant. Also, they are just prone to having destiny kind of warp around them being a character like they are. Not necessarily, but narratively. And so, they always seem to be heading in the right direction, which I do think is quite powerful. I do think A is overall where Exemplar lands, though you could very much argue that it's not that different than a lot of other martials. Roleplay material-wise, really good. You can, if you know of a demigod of some kind, like their literal whole idea is telling a story. That's their whole thing. They build their epithets as they continue on, and it's super flavorful. It's super dynamic. The way you can play can be super dynamic as well. Exemplar is really, really interesting. The only problem I see with Exemplar is the fact that, one, it's a rare class, and two, some GMs don't like the chosen one kind of characters. It's very, look at me syndrome, very spotlighty, and it's something that I feel like a lot of GMs will kind of rebuff in some form or fashion. But I don't think that's necessarily a problem of the class, but the perception of the class. So I'm going to say S, tentatively. S overall, because there's just a lot of different ways you could do it, and there's so many different stories of interesting characters who are demigods. They're just prone to having really, really good stories, and that's all what roleplay is really about. So with 2 A's and an S, I'm going to put Exemplar bottom of S. I think they're really good. I think they're very solid. I don't think combat-wise they're that much stronger than, like, say, a Barbarian. In fact, I would say Barbarian is overall stronger in combat. But a lot of their other features just makes her a very fun character. And I think that's kind of what the tier list is about, is fun characters. So if we're talking about what class I think would be the most fun to play, Exemplar is definitely up there, generally speaking, not player preference speaking. So yeah, and I've unintentionally made a long dick. So let's get something on here to hopefully change this image. Fighter. Oh no. I didn't rate Fighter super well last time, and I don't think that's gonna change. All right, Fighter. S tier combat. I don't think I need to explain more. The increase in accuracy is incredibly hard to just... They're just the best in single target damage. They hit more often. They have so many feats dedicated to just hitting and dealing damage. They're designed to fight. They do suffer when an enemy is resistant or even immune to physical damage types. Then a fighter really starts sweating it. But due to overall game balance, most enemies are at most resistant into some degree, and fighters that even have ways of getting around resistances, like something like double slice. So yeah, S tier fighter in combat. I think that goes without explanation. Exploration. They have nothing. Like, they do have some feats that make them really good at recalled knowledge, but only in combat. The class itself offers nothing in combat. They are a Dex strength class, so they are going to be choosing mostly things that, like climbing, sure, can get them in places, but they're not that good at it. You're not relying on your fighter outside of combat situations all that much. And so I'm going to put fighters like overall exploration capabilities at a C. It's pretty bad. They don't even have the benefit that Barbarians do to like make it easier to break things as much. So they don't offer anything. I won't say that they're D. D on here is mostly just decorative at this point. Like, to have a D would mean that the character just offers nothing in said category, which Pathfinder really doesn't do. So it's there mostly as a showpiece. With Fighter, you could substitute some of your core stat in order to make your character have more skill proficiencies, increase their intelligence, make them good at talking. That's very interesting, but then we're just adjusting the scales, Then we're just taking their S quality down and bumping up their social quality. So, or whatever other quality, whatever exploration activity you're trying to do. So C overall for exploration. They don't have anything. They don't have any feats or class abilities really focused on that. And speaking on focused on things, roleplay. The fighter is just a dude. And what I mean by that is your one trait is you're really good at combat or a type of combat. Maybe you're a soldier or a mercenary or something like that. But that's the thing. Your character is so good in combat that, narratively speaking, to rationalize your character's capabilities in combat is they're either talented or they've been doing this a while. So if you're trying to rationalize your character's capabilities, narratively speaking, you're kind of shoehorned into one of two spots. And their class doesn't offer roleplay anything. Like, sure, you have a weapon you like in particular and you're really, really good with that weapon. There are, I will say, some story stuff related to that, but it's not anything different than any other fighter or mercenary don't person would be. And even if you were a genius, you're like a genius or talented with a particular weapon. They don't offer a lot, unfortunately. So I'm going to have to say that fighter is going to get another C in roleplay, which is very interesting. Such a spiky class. We have S tier combat, one of the best combat classes in the game. Exploration and roleplay, they're just kind of bottom rung. And again, that's not that you can't make interesting characters. It's just the class itself, its features and proclivities don't lean towards anything in those categories whatsoever. It's very much a beginner's class because you don't have to try hard to at least survive combat, which is, important. So yeah, fighter overall. So that's an S and 2 C's. So if we take S down to A, that makes one of them a B. If we take it down to B, that brings the other one. Yeah, so that brings fighter up to B and probably bottom B overall. Like not even beating out champion because I feel like champion overall scores better. So yeah, fighter, pretty much bottom B. Gunslinger. This one is very interesting because it has a lot of the same problems with fighter, only in more tedious ways. One, you just are less flexible. And two, you're using a fighting style that doesn't generate the most single target DPR because of things like reloading and the fact that your main weapon type typically is not doing a lot of damage until you crit, and then you do a lot of damage because of fatal. So Gunslinger, despite being another legendary proficiency class, doesn't have the same wiggle room that fighter does. And a lot of the weapons that they use don't really do anything else than let them just shoot people from a range. They're really good at shooting people, especially with guns, but that is not really great combat-wise when a fighter is just good with like everything else, like better with everything else, and almost as good with a gun, depending. So Gunslinger, I'm going to have to put an A in combat. Exploration. Honestly, with things like Black Powder Boost and a lot of the other weird shenanigans that Gunslinger can do, I think they have some interesting out-of-combat capabilities. Not a lot, but I feel like it at least offers something more than fighter does. And Spell Shot gives you a little bit more as well. So I'm going to rate it B. It's not a lot. It's really not a lot. It's more like a C+, if I'm going to be honest. But for many of the same reasons that the fighter has, Gunslinger is mostly dedicated to just shooting, though they do have certain fighting styles like the Pistolero that is more focused on like debuffing and using social actions, and so they're very motivated to invest in things like their charisma. And being a ranged fighter, they don't need to worry about their constitution that often, or ranged martial, I should say, because, objectively, they're trying not to be in melee combat. So I do feel like they just overall have more than the fighter, but less than most other classes. So I'm going to put their overall exploration in B. And roleplay. You're the class that is like fighter, only you're more specifically guns. Now, it is interesting because narratively speaking, in Golarion, guns are uncommon or even rare, depending on where you're from. And they have their own kind of interesting culture and history. But so do like any other martial weapon that a fighter could theoretically just be hyper invested into. Sure, guns are more interesting, I say, than most of those other weapons. So you might have a proclivity to be a little bit more interesting than just like a fighter. But at the same time, I don't know. Though the fact that you're only good with ranged weapons and not like a fighter who, is good with like any potential type of weapon means that there might be some narrative reason for it or not. I don't know. It feels like such a half step up from fighter, narratively speaking, that roleplay wise, I don't think Gunslinger really offers anything other than the fact that people think guns are cool. You know what? It's mostly that people think guns are cool. And if the Druid gets knocked because a lot of people just think that Druids only do a certain thing, Gunslingers are kind of just inherently cool by nature of using guns. Yeah, this is such a different tier list than it was before. Much less logic in some of the things I'm saying. So, that being said, I'm going to say Gunslinger is going to get a B plus in their roleplay. Edging out fighter only by the cool factor, and that's really all about it. So, yeah. So, with an A and 2 Bs, this does put Gunslinger, I feel like, in above fighter, but not quite champion. Champion should be like lower A, but I think champion belongs in upper B. And Gunslinger would be the top of B if any other class would be. So overall, Gunslinger, pretty good, though, carried by how cool guns are. Inventor, oh, I love the Inventor. I think this class is so cool. So, combat-wise, Inventor is really, really good if you know how to utilize the weapon trait system. The weapon innovation is really good, and you can do a lot of really cool and interesting things in it. And with the various power boosts you can do, you can amp yourself up. Of the classes that are like martial but not quite martial, Inventor is the best of those, I think, competing with many martials when mostly they're using the weapon innovation. Now, the armor innovation can be good as well, but it loses some of the functionality that weapon traits really adds. And Construct Companion, while good, is not that necessarily great in combat because companions in general just are not the same tier as a overall martial. So Inventor, I think, is B+. Weapon innovation, definitely A. The other two, more B, unfortunately. They can do some really cool things, have a lot of interesting potential, and they have some really cool powers, though they did change the DC for your weapons, like blowing up in your face at stability or something like that. But it's still like a 1 in 4 chance, or 1 in 4 chance that your weapon doesn't just, stop being able to be used when you're doing it or when you're using it in combat. So some of those features you just can't use a lot. It very much is upper B, I'm going to say. Not quite A, but not lower B. Exploration wise, Inventor has the unique capability of their main class skill being automatically upgraded. They automatically increase their crafting as they level, leaving their skill proficiency increases to be pretty much whatever they want. Yeah, sure, they're an intelligence-based class, but that skill can make them really good at things like magic if they really wanted to, or at least knowledge of magic. Or, because they're an intelligence-based class, they also just get a lot of trained skill proficiencies. And honestly, a little bit more than most other classes in overall like legendary skill proficiency potential because crafting automatically improves as they level up. So overall, I'm going to say exploration is B. B because unlike spells that are just really good in exploration and can help you do anything, no matter how good your character is in something like swimming, you're not going to be swimming as well as just someone who buffs you up with magic to do so. And while the Inventor can come up with a lot of gadgets and can be really useful in a lot of situations, you know what? Actually, no, I changed my mind. A, their ability to like be really good lockpickers and to have a tool for any kind of situation just makes them really handy. And they do have actually a lot of feats that make them really handy for things in exploration mode as well. And just the extra skill. Yeah, I'm going to say A overall. It's something that I think that you can do well. Low A, A-, you can do well, but not necessarily as good as a caster. So not quite at the same level of casters, but I will say they're pretty good. And roleplay. I think they have an insane amount of roleplay potential. Your character augmenting a weapon or suit of armor or even a companion doesn't root you into a specific like mentality. Unlike Artificer, which kind of has more of a mad sciencey kind of, well, to be fair, a lot of Inventor has a lot of mad scientists like, no, I created you, kind of feats, which are kind of goofy. When in practice, an Inventor character isn't as definitively viewed as other classes. Like Alchemist, a lot of their stuff is vials and drinking consumables and all that kind of stuff. But Inventor, like, you could make Nero from Devil May Cry essentially an Inventor, with the Red Queen being in a weapon innovation. And you can just say that a lot of the cool things your character can do are due to the modifications of your weapon, you know, and maybe some other gadgets. I mean, the Devil Breaker is also just a gadget. So Nero could definitely be an Inventor if you wanted to make that kind of character. So you have a pretty wide range. I think they're very, very potent in roleplay. I think there's a lot of things you can do, and the class is filled with all kinds of potential. And, you know, I don't think the class hands you S-tier narrative, but I think they do really well to give you a lot of options. So with a B+, an A-, and a solid A, this puts them into, I think, the upper part of in the middle. They're in the middle category, probably above Druid and above Bard. Yeah, B+, AA. Did Bard have S in combat? No. Yeah. So, yeah, definitely this. It's that B+. It's literally that B+ combat where they can be really good in combat if you go weapon innovation. But, you know, if we're looking on average, kind of not so. So I think they're really, really good overall. I don't think Inventor is better than Bard in combat. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that B+ in combat, along with their other features, kind of just beats out Bard's bad reputation, which is really, that's all it is. If Bard wasn't nerfed by its reputation, Bard would be a little bit higher. That's all it is. So yeah, Inventor, pretty good, upper A, which I'm very content with. I think it definitely deserves to be there. Investigator, this is my favorite class and the one I'm going to have the most bias of any of these classes. So, Investigator, combat-wise, I think they're very, especially after Player Core 2, with the new stratagems you can do. Like an attack stratagem is very solid. There's very interesting ways you can play Investigator. An Investigator Sniper is insane because as long as you're outside of combat, you can essentially keep devising a stratagem as long as the enemy is within, you know, like whatever range your gun is using. It doesn't even matter because you just keep rolling until you get a nat 20 because, you know, it's just a 6-second timer, more or less. So depending on how long an enemy is there, you can line up a shot and then start a combat off with a headshot, which is insanely powerful. Also, the skill potential of Investigator gives them a lot of options in combat. Even if an Investigator isn't as strong as a fighter, they can have a near competent level of athletics that are about the same, purely due to the fact that they can just have a lot of skill increases that fighter just normally wouldn't have access to. And in addition to this, with the skill stratagem, you can be really good at tripping too, adding your pursue lead bonus to those checks, which is very potent as well. So overall, I'm going to say that the Investigator is really, really good, not S tier in combat, but with its strategic strike. The only thing I think is the combat proficiency. To play well as an Investigator, I think takes a little bit more thinking power than a lot of people really want to put into it. So I'm going to drop it to A-. It's still an A, but A- because it takes a little bit more thinking. It's not quite as intuitive, but you can be really good in combat as an Investigator. And, oh, you know what? Actually, I'm thinking about now, because they're one of the classes that really focus on agile finesse weapons, they are sacrificing some overall damage potential. And it's not like the class has like staying potential or even buffing potential in combat. You know what? B+. We're going to go with another B+, kind of like Inventor. They have a lot of really good potential. I would say even more than an Inventor normally would, but maybe not even more than that. Yeah, I'm going to say they're about the same as the Inventor, honestly. So really good, but I think player skill is gonna factor into it more than it would for a lot of other classes. Exploration, S tier. It's a skill monkey class. It's going to the Investigator is going to be good at so many different types of roles, and being one of the few classes that gets legendary perception is also going to be really good at perception, which is a very commonly used skill. Like, while Investigator does not share a lot of the same potential that spellcasters do in exploration, they are going to be really good at one of the things every player does, which is roll skill checks. And they're going to be one of the best at it, especially when they're on a case. Their investigative bonus is just really, really good. And they're really solid. So yeah, they're really, really good. Also, some of their methodologies are very, very exploration focused. They even can help propel the plot along. Like, I don't think there's a class that is as S tier as Investigator is when it comes to exploration mode. It's just kind of what the class is designed to do. Now, roleplay. This is a very interesting one because similar to Inventor, when you see an Investigator in practice, they don't really come across as like a particular idea. Now, a lot of the imagery around it is definitely like Sherlock Holmesy. Your character is an investigator, PI. And I think that definitely, taint isn't the right word, but it very much colors how a lot of people look at Investigator in general. But the way their skill proficiencies work, and even a lot of their skills aren't necessarily dedicated to a specific action other than figuring out what's going on. You can just be an intelligent character who fights very methodically. There we go. It's a class that's very strategic. You can, I think, color the Investigator in a lot of different ways. And due to the sheer number of skill proficiencies and due to the fact that a lot of their general class features are more roleplay based than anything, like the Investigator is a character who is there to kind of figure out what's going on. And so they're really good in a lot of different stories. I think they're very competent. So while maybe not interesting S, I'm going to say S roleplay because the Investigator is always going to be part of why the group is moving forward in the plot. Almost always. They're so good at so many skill points, and their character can be so interesting because of that I think S overall. So that's 2 S's and a B+, which I do think does make this above Investigator and above Exemplar. Exemplar, I think, is pretty competent overall, but I think that the Investigator tops out just because, narratively speaking and roleplay speaking, or not roleplay, exploration speaking, they're better and they're like as competent in combat and better in like exploration mode, like way better in exploration mode. And narratively speaking, I think Exemplar is more interesting. Don't get me wrong. I'm not comparing that necessarily that quality, but I think that you can just play Investigator in a lot of very interesting ways and have very interesting stories. And similar to the Exemplar, they're always kind of like near the heart of where the story is moving forward, which I think is something worth mentioning. So yeah, Investigator, so far, top of S. Probably my bias. If you're going to dislike the video, you might as well dislike it now. I know a lot of people don't like Investigator because it's too complicated in combat, which I agree. That's why I gave it a B+, but it's S everywhere else. So yeah. Speaking on S everywhere else, oh my God, the Kineticist is such a good class. The Kineticist is just one of the most competent classes in the game, almost overpowered. Not necessarily on an individual level. A specific Kineticist is not necessarily more potent than most other classes, but the class compared to some of the other classes is broken. Like, not broken, but It definitely shines. It can just do pretty much anything. So combat. Kineticist's literal only downside is it doesn't have the same DPR as most martials, and even then it can kind of push close. It can get really, really close. Not as close as fighter, but unlike fighter, it can do decent martial and do massive area damage. So much is built area damage wise. Or you can go Woodgate and have Protector Tree, Infinite Protector Tree, which is just busted. That's just extra HP for 2 actions every round. It's an infinite spell. They get a lot of infinite spells. They're just really good. You can go super tanky. There's so many builds that do so many things that the only thing a Kineticist can't do in combat is the same single target DPR that a Barbarian or a Fighter could. So it's S tier for pretty much everything that they aren't. It's really, really good in combat. Speaking on really, really good in combat, Exploration, unmatched. Because of how they can split their gate or fork their gate, they can have an answer for any situation. They can give their group flights. They can let their group breathe underwater if they need to, or create air bubbles or whatever. They can manipulate earth, get a burrow speed even, which is insanely powerful. They get a lot of the benefits that like primal spellcasters do, with the added benefit of that most of their things are just infinite use spells. Like, not every Kineticist is going to be as good in Exploration. And, you know, depending on the player's build, they could be definitely more combat focused than anything. But that doesn't mean that that potential isn't there. And with Reflow, I think it's Reflow, they have this ability that lets them, let me check it out real quick. I was right. It is Reflow. They get the ability like a fighter does to just change out some of their feats. They can have the Exploration pretty easily, honestly. Actually, I didn't even mention that Inventor kind of gets that same benefit as well. But Inventor, though they can do that, I don't think they have quite the same potential. So yeah, Kineticist, S tier in Exploration mode. They're really good. Unmatched even, depending on again, as a class, unmatched. An individual Kineticist may be more or less restricted depending on what the build the player is going for. And finally, roleplay. I think this is the only category they're not going to get an S in. They are interesting. Your ties to different elements can definitely give your character different themes, but you're always kind of manipulating elements. You don't get to really explore other character ideas. Like, I'm a mercenary who just happens to bend elements. Like that bending elements is kind of your character's whole thing. You could disguise it and pretend to be using magic, which I guess is interesting. But it is something that, like, elements are always going to be tied, and especially what element you pick kind of does the same thing that Cleric or Champion has, where you just, like, you choose an element, and even if you fork the gate, you're still going to have that element it can evolve. I'm sure it can evolve. I just don't think it's S tier. That's the thing. That's the only thing I'm talking about right now. It's A tier. You can have a lot of different types of Kineticists. Your play style, because it can be like full support, tank, even damage, like area damage especially, you can play a lot of different ideas of characters, but I don't think the class gives you necessarily interesting story elements that makes your character more fascinating. So Kineticist, I'm going to say, is A+. You could argue S with the different gate junctions, because you can get certain skill proficiencies with that, which can be really interesting. And your class is actually evolving as you level, but I'm going to say A+ overall, just because that's the vibe I'm getting, right? Not quite S. I haven't felt a solid S from its roleplay, but this does put Kineticist right at the top of S tier, which if you've played Kineticist, you're probably not surprised. Kineticist is arguably one of the best classes in the game, if not the best class in the game. It's just really, really good. Oh, Magus. All right. I know a lot of you hate how I say that, and I'm not going to change. So Magus is very interesting because, objectively speaking, Magus is one of the best damage class, or is probably the best damage class in the game. It's arguable whether they beat out Fighter just because of accuracy differences, but spell striking is insanely potent. It's because you could even just cantrip spell striking, you could get into a flow that very easily makes it where you can constantly keep spell striking round after round, and you can do a lot of damage. When you miss, it hurts, don't get me wrong, but if you're playing with your team correctly and everything like that, objectively speaking, Magus is very, very powerful. Very, very powerful. Again, I've done over 300 damage in a round as Magus, and I wasn't playing super optimally. Like, it's just how good the class is at dealing damage. And again, probably arguably better at it than Fighter, though accuracy and yada yada. You're not going to be consistently better at it, but when you are, you are. So I want to put this in S tier. My gripe with the class overall is it's very specifically tied to spell striking, but that's a fun thing. And we're not talking about fun in combat. We're talking about combat capability. I'm going to have to say S-. S- because I don't think, because there's pretty much one style of Magus play to play to be S tier combat, you play Magus one specific way. If you're playing any other way, you're A tier. So I'm going to say S-. But Magus is, I think, objectively a very powerful class in combat, but I feel like it's very restrictive. And honestly, if the combat is very dynamic, if there's different, if it's a very complicated map, I think Magus would struggle, depending on what Laughing Shadow wouldn't, but a lot of others would. And they're just so action hungry, and they never have enough actions to do what they want. S-. S- because I acknowledge that they are a living nuke, but I wouldn't want to use it if I didn't have to. You know what I mean? So S-. Exploration. Interesting. They are more dynamic than a fighter, but their spell slots are kind of precious, arguably. Because Magus can do just as well with its cantrips, honestly, rather than using its spell slots, it has a lot of reason to use what spell slots it does have for exploration purposes. And because it's a class that has some care for the spell DCs, it will likely have some intelligence, meaning that you're going to have a little bit more general skill proficiencies. I'm going to say it's overall a B, because it's not as good as it's not as good as a skill monkey, and it's not as good as being a full caster who has just a lot of spell slots to waste. Magus has to really pick and choose. So I'd say B+ overall for its exploration. It can do some interesting things with its stuff if you decide not to go super combat-y. And I feel like there's a lot of reasons to not go super combat-y with all your spells. Just because when you miss with a spell strike, it feels uber bad. So I feel like overall, B+. They have that potential, just having innate spell casting, but not always. So yeah, B+ I think is very fitting. Roleplay. I think I want to say S tier. Magus has a lot of very interesting narrative elements. S tier because who doesn't want to play a Gish, right? Who doesn't want to play a character who's good at martial and magic? And they're really fun. They are all the great things of a martial class with a lot of the fun benefits of magic. And surprisingly, of the many classes out there, they have some of the most just roleplay relevant feats. One of their feats, Spirit Sheath, just lets you just put your weapon in a pocket dimension so you can hide it and pull it out whenever. But let's be real here. That's not being used for combat purposes. That's not being used for exploration. Sure, maybe you can backstab someone with it. Kind of cool. You're doing it because you like the imagery of it. It's such a weeb, it's such weeb bait for a class. And so many people, I think, really, really like the idea of Magus. And despite my own personal preferences when it comes to play style, I wanted to play a Magus, and I made a very interesting Magus. And Magus has so many weird and interesting ways it can intermix the use of magic with martial. So definitely S, because you're going to play an interesting character. If you're playing a Magus, you're going to be playing an interesting character just inherently. They're just very, very prone to doing so because they have such an interesting and flashy class style. So, interestingly enough, this is going to put Magus in S tier. We have an S minus, a B, and an S, which puts it, I think, I've moved the wrong thing because I've clicked off. There you go. I think it puts Magus in bottom of S. Maybe? Ooh. Yes. Just because it has an S. Well, because Exemplar is bottom of A, I feel like. So, yeah. Okay. I think that's good. So, Kineticist, Investigator, Magus, and Exemplar. Honestly, I feel like my thoughts have definitely changed a lot playing the game. And I think the list is starting to reflect that a bit. I think I didn't make Investigator S last time because I was afraid of my bias. But when I really think about the potential of it, I think it's really good. You could argue it's A, but I don't think anything less than that. All right. Monk. Man, this video is already going on like an hour and a half. And I am probably halfway done. This is a long video. But I'm sure many people out there will like it. And I will be leaving timestamps. So, you know. Anyway, Monk, combat-wise, very competent. Also, interestingly enough, they can have probably some of the best AC early game, which is really good for early game struggles. And they have the ability to affect a lot of certain types of well, they can hit almost any kind of weakness if they pick the right kind of feats. But very specifically, like metal resistances are the weaknesses are the ones they're best at, and they're really good at getting through enemy weaknesses too. They're very, very competent in combat. They're a martial class, so being very single target, I think, is very much a like a given. But I think they can attack in a lot of different ways. They're really good at doing things like tripping enemies or grappling them or all kinds of stuff like that. I think Monk's really good. I'm going to give it an A+. I don't think Monk has the same oomph that Barbarian or Fighter does as far as like straight up combat capabilities. But I think they're very, very competent and can be played very, very well. And I think a lot of people could play them very, very well. I think I would even argue low S, but I think A+ is I think where I'm putting them. They feel as good as a lot of martials, only a little bit better just because they flow really well. And the stances give them a lot of variety. Exploration. Monk actually is one of the best exploration-based martials in the game. They get the ability to like run on water. Because they can amp up their physical capabilities to superhuman levels, they can do things most other martials really can't. They can run up walls. They can run over water. They could swim super well if they really wanted to. And because they are a strength-based class and they are very athletics focused as well, they do suffer in things like social stuff. I'll say that they are A-, which is good for a martial because that puts it in relatively the same categories of spellcasters, but it's very like specifically for themselves. A monk will probably get to where your party needs to go before anyone else does. They just have this stuff. Like while a spellcaster is getting ready, a monk is just super fast and just will be there. And they have so many movement options. So with their pure movement options, a monk can really get anywhere they need to. And they're very competent in combat. And also, like, they don't have to have weapons anywhere they go. This actually makes them a lot better in different kinds of scenes, which means that they have more options for like how they set up a combat, which I count as being exploration. So yeah, I think upper A, or not upper A, low A, A-, which I think is good. I think that's very solid for Monk overall. And role play. I love a good fisticuff user myself, but martial arts is pretty much all the Monk has to offer. Now they have a lot of cool like key-based things. They can have some interesting spirituality, but when people think Monk, they have a very specific idea in mind. And while a lot of people do use Monk differently, like I don't feel like it's the same thing as Druid, where you see a Druid and most people play Druid similarly. I don't think most people play monks similarly. I think people play monks in very different ways. But I don't think the class necessarily offers anything different. It's just a fun class to play. And so with the styles can dictate as well, like parts of your character's past. Maybe there's a reason why your character knows a specific style, the key stuff. I'm going to say it's better than some of the other classes, like say a Gunslinger, for instance. So I'm going to say A as well for their role play. You know what? B plus. I think B plus is fair. I think because you're always tied to fisticuffs in some way or using martial weapons, there's a lot of very like particular things a monk player leans into, which makes it a little restrictive. I think they have a lot of potential. Like any of these do have infinite potential. All these could be S roleplay wise. But if I'm looking at what the class gives and what you could tell stories with, it's mostly the key stuff and like the individual styles informing your particular play style. It's so hard. I'm going to say it doesn't really matter, but I'm going to say B plus. It feels like B plus is the vibe, right? So that is A plus, A minus, B plus. If we just drop the A plus and bring up the B to a B minus, then we have a pretty good solid B class overall. I'll say with a lot of potential. I'm going to put it, I think it beats out Bard because of Bard's terrible reputation. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think Bard's terrible reputation, again, just kind of drops it a little bit. It's not that bad. I keep saying terrible reputation like it's super bad. It's still A tier. Bard is still A tier. It's just, it people play bards in a very specific way, and I feel like people play monks in very specific ways, but less so. So yeah, I like this placement a lot. I think right below Inventor, but above Bard is really, really good. I like Alchemist a lot, and I'm seeing it just drop lower and lower on the A overall, which makes me sad. But that's just how it goes. It's not necessarily my opinions, though they may color it a bit. Oh, speaking about opinions, Oracle. Oof. All right. This one's going to be controversial no matter what I say, so I'm just going to say what I'm thinking. Oracle, combat-wise, I would say Oracle is potentially the strongest caster. They can pump their spells using they're also a class that has a unique additional focus pool with their curse-bound trait. So their curse-bound trait is like a secondary focus pool, which means they're a caster with two focus pools, essentially. And they can amp their spells, they can amp their damage. They got some really cool abilities with their curse-bound, giving them essentially extra spells that, of casters, I do genuinely think Oracle is probably the strongest caster overall. I don't know if that pushes them into S tier, which is kind of weird to say, but they're really, really good, but they still don't have the single target potential of most martials, and they don't have the staying power of more supporty characters. Now, they are a divine caster, which is also a little bit of a knock, but they have a lot of ways to get around being a divine caster, and of divine casters, they're definitely the strongest as far as like damage potential, but not pure support potential. I'm going to say A+. Oracle's A+ for casters because it's just genuinely really, really good. Exploration. It's a divine caster, and with all the extra benefits they get for being good at casting, they don't necessarily get that in the direction that makes them better in exploration mode. I'm going to say a solid B, actually, for overall its exploration potential. Just being because it's a divine caster is what really makes it a B amongst casters. It's sad, but it's not anywhere as bad as like a gunslinger or a fighter as far as exploration is concerned. All right, role play. Okay, this is the part that's either people are going to either love or hate, and there's really no way around it. I genuinely think that the class was made less interesting to play when Player Core 2 came out. I think there was a lot of fun with the jank, and that made players very conscious of the curses. And playing around the curses, I think, actually informed a lot of interesting roleplay. Why your character is suffering the way they do, the ingenuitive way they got around their curse, I think were all really, really cool things that has been stripped away in Player Core 2, leaving, yes, a very accessible class. And yes, I would say, again, it was kind of before, but even more so now, probably the most potent of casters. True. But roleplay-wise, I feel like the class got a lot of its interesting stuff stripped out of its basic class features and were forced more into its feats. Now, its feats are very flavorful, very interesting, and it has a very cool vibe. So I'm overall gonna say A. I think it was S before, if I'm not mistaken, but it's A now. I think that's because overall, I feel like they do have a lot of interesting things, but it's mostly through feats. And while that necessarily isn't a bad thing, it's bad because of what we lost in exchange. And in addition to that, also, okay, this is more of a mechanic thing than roleplay, but some curses are just much, much easier to deal with than some of the other ones. Like some curses feel like they do nothing terrible for you at all. In which case, I feel like there's a lot of players who are just going to kind of minimize their losses and pick curses that are not relevant to their character, but are just more mechanically easy to get around. So I think that hurts it quite a bit. I think that actually, that tunes my thought quite a bit. I'm going to say B. Yeah. I'm going to say overall B for its roleplay potential. I think they have a lot of interesting potential, but because curses got nerfed a bit and because they're just less interesting than they are before, there's just a lot of people who are going to pick certain curses, not because of the story reasons, but because of the mechanics, which I feel like hurts the class's overall like narrative potential. So that puts it actually in the B range. I'm going to say right above Gunslinger and Fighter overall, because, you know, still better in generally in exploration. Well, yeah, a bit better than Gunslinger, I would say. And combat wise, very potent, but not as good as Fighter and is. But just having more narrative, like definitely more narrative potential than either of the two. Like the curses are genuinely interesting. Don't get me wrong. The curses are genuinely interesting. But if I'm being unbiased and if I'm looking at what I think people are going to do with it, I feel like a lot of people they have less reason to make interesting things than they used to. So yeah, I argue their roleplay potential could be A, not S, but A for sure. And if it was A, that would probably put them bottom A. But I think I like them in B more. I feel like, if anything, if it comes down to just my vibe on it, I think B is right where they belong as far as the classes are. I feel like when I'm comparing this list, I feel like that's definitely where Oracle belongs. Or Oracle. Psychic. Psychic's very interesting. I love Psychic, and I think Psychic is very cool. Combat-wise, Psychic has a really, really good set of cantrips that gives them a little bit more of a combat oomph than I feel like a lot of casters feel. But they do lack a lot of the bigger spell slots. So while they don't have as much big boom, they are much more consistent than a lot of other casters over the course of an entire day. I do think that's definitely worth mentioning, but at the same time, I feel like their lack of spell slots is actually genuinely an issue. I think that I do think because of their, you know, their ability to use their, like I have a Psychic in our game and he's very consistently really good. He feels consistently like a caster in combat, but I feel like maybe late game we'll really start feeling the difference between a Psychic and other casters. And maybe I just need to see more late game Psychic stuff to really have a better idea. I do think they have some really good combat potential, and some of their different conscious minds and subconscious minds, I think, have different roles they could play. Yeah, I'm going to say B+ for combat overall. I think they're good, But I feel like without the amount of big boom that other casters get later game, they're just good because they have much more stamina than casters, which may or may not be relevant, especially because a lot of dungeons in the modules are like 3 or 4 fights long, which is just enough to make a lot of casters feel like they're tapped out. And that's just when the psychic is like, oh yeah, we're getting into the long bit now. And then it kind of ends. And when it comes to like travel combat, you're only doing like 1 battle a day. So yeah, I think B is definitely B+, I think, for sure. Exploration mode. This is actually not a great one for Psychic either. Now, some of their subconscious minds are really, really good because the cantrips they offer a lot of potential in exploration mode. But because they are, one, occult casters, which is a bit more limited, mostly for manipulating people and stuff like that, but not for like movement or going places necessarily. They're really, really good in a lot of social situations, I feel like, or investigative, or even like espionage. A good amount, but not everything. I'm going to say A-. I think A- is pretty accurate. They're good in a lot of ways, especially in social things, but they can't do the same things that like an arcane caster can, which actually it's surprising we haven't really come up with it. Well, we have one arcane caster, which is Magus, which I guess is fair, but yeah, being a cult, I think, hurts a little bit in this category, but I think it's still A, so A-. And finally, roleplay. This is weird. Psychics traditionally in media are really interesting, but that's because psychics usually exist in media where magic doesn't, or psychics are like the casters of their various setting. But because psychics in this game work pretty much the same as casters with just a different way, I feel like they don't offer in anything different. Like if someone in the setting is using magic versus a psychic ability, there's no mechanical real difference between the two. And functionally, there's no real major differences either, which I think really hurts the psychic. I think that's very unfortunate because I think psychics overall are cool. I think they have a cool factor. And just to be like, I don't use spells. I kind of just vibrate things, even though their spells still use manipulate actions and use like verbal components or have auditory traits. Yeah, they just don't feel like they're the thing they are, which should be something that's a caster but not a caster, doesn't come across mechanically speaking like at all. So I will say that they're marginally more interesting than a gunslinger or a fighter, but only marginally so. I'm going to say B as well. So we have a B+, an A-, and a B overall, making this, I think, another one I'm going to put below Oracle. Yeah, that feels right. Feels pretty good. I think that they're really potent in a lot of ways. And I think that overall, they're not a bad class by any means. And I mean, B is not bad. B is just, they're interesting. I would play one. B is I would play one. A is like, I'd like to play one. And S is, it's my next character if I haven't played one already. Ranger, I in first edition Pathfinder, Ranger was my favorite class, actually. I really have liked Rangers traditionally, and I just haven't been as interested in them in second edition, even though they're really good. So combat-wise, Ranger, I would say, is S tier. They are really good at range combat because they can shoot from further than other classes, which is strategically incredibly powerful. In addition to this, Flurry Ranger has the same DPR potential, if not better DPR potential, than a fighter. Because what they lack in accuracy, they make up for in quantity. And quantity in, like, Rangers get better accuracy the more they strike, which is unique amongst many of the martials. So combat-wise, if I give fighter S tier, I have to give it to Ranger because they do a lot of the same things. The only difference maybe being that Ranger can kind of give itself more bonuses in other areas, while Fighter mostly focuses purely on combat. So I would say on average, a Fighter is better, but Ranger has a potential to be as good, if not better. So S tier, Exploration, actually probably one of the best marshals for doing so that are not just a skill monkey. With the exploration mode, they're really good at survival, which is very, very handy in a lot of types of campaigns. Tracking enemies is really good. They're also another class that gets a legendary proficiency in perception, which is very, very useful. They're really good. I don't think they compare to casters in a lot of ways, and they don't compare to something like a skill monkey when it comes to a lot of things, but compared to other marshals, like Ranger is just generally better in exploration, I feel like. Even compared to Monk, I feel like, generally speaking, Ranger is better in exploration mode. So I'm going to say a very solid A, like middle A category there. Now, role play. I think a lot of people don't fully understand what a Ranger actually is or supposed to be. And I feel like even in lore, it's not super clear. That's to their benefit, but also a downside. They're someone who kind of just does better in in wild environments, and that's where they get a lot of their benefits. Their players are prone to play them in a very uncharismatic way, or in a way that feels very cold, because they're people who just prefer like solitude or being in the wilderness or whatever. I think the new Inquisitor class archetype changes some of that and can give them a very urban twist, which I think is very, very interesting. And Inquisitor, I think, is a very big boost in this category. But I would say a Ranger doesn't evoke a lot of thoughts. Now, Animal Companion, good. The Inquisitor, or not Inquisitor, Vindicator, I said Inquisitor before. The Vindicator class archetype, good. I would say probably A-. That feels the most right. I haven't been super eager to play one myself, but when I really think about it, well, they kind of have the reputation thing that a bard does. Like, a lot of people who play Rangers in very specific ways. But I feel like the Animal Companion potential is good, and it makes for a very interesting story, potentially. And the fact that they have the new Vindicator, I think boosts, I think for what I would traditionally give it a B+, I'm going to give an A- to A ranking. So that's 2 A's and an S. I think that puts Ranger right above Cleric as far as classes are concerned. I think that feels really good too. It's a very good class overall. I think there's a lot of interesting ways you could play it. I think it's just overall roleplay wise, you could argue it's above or below something like Cleric, there's a lot of different interesting ways, and there's a lot of interesting ideas for Cleric, but like if we're comparing a Cleric to a Ranger, I think the Ranger has overall more potential. Oh boy, we're hour 45 by my recording, blah blah blah. It's hard to talk for a long period of time, okay? My speech is starting to slur because it's just a lot of talking and thinking. All right, Rogue. Rogue in combat is pretty good. There's a lot of ways people have found fun and unique ways to use Rogue, and with its backstab potential, it's really good. Sneak attack damage can be used in a lot of very powerful ways, and with the Thug rackets, I think it's just a very potent class. I would say it puts it on par with classes like the Ranger, where not always necessarily S, but can be S. I don't think it's quite so S. One, because precision damage is honestly very frequently just enemies are immune to it. They just don't have organs, which completely erases sneak attack. And in addition to this, you have to have a lot of good setup for some of the things you do. So to optimize your damage, single target damage, there's a lot of things. Now, you are a skill monkey, which gives you a lot of options, very similar to the Investigator. And I would say overall, in comparison to the Investigator, which I'll remind you all had a B+, I'm going to say that Rogue is overall a very competent martial with its skill potential and everything like that, and its damage potential. So I'm going to say A. Very solidly A. more so than Investigator, which also uses precision damage. But I think Rogue overall does the job in combat very, very well. Exploration. I think this is another S tier. Rogues have so many skills that they can do pretty much anything. They're mostly rolling skill checks. This is a game where it's all about rolling skill checks. And rogues have some really good feats for getting into places they're not supposed to be, which is also very, very handy in a wide variety of ways. So I think overall, rogues' exploration potential, S tier. Roleplay. I think roleplay rogues are very potent. Many of their rackets, especially with the new Avenger rackets, can make your rogue just be a different kind of person. A thug feels different than a mastermind, which feels different than an Avenger, which feels different than a thief, you know? So I think that the class innately pushes you to very interesting play styles. And your character's skill potentials, because you get so many skill proficiencies, more so than even Investigator, because there's not a limit on what you can give yourself skill feats in or skill increases in, I would say puts Rogue above even the Investigator. So I would say overall in exploration mode, or not exploration mode, in roleplay, Rogue is S tier. It's just good in a lot of ways, and it's very, very handy. So with an A and 2 S's, I think Rogue jumps up just under Kineticist. I think Kineticist overall can just be more interesting and can do a lot more things, especially like when it comes to combat. But I think Rogue is really good. And in comparison to Investigator, which the two classes are very similar, maybe even too similar, in fact, some people would argue. The major difference is that Rogue is just better in combat than Investigator. I think Investigator, roleplay-wise, is more interesting. And I would say Rogue is S-. Yeah, S- in roleplay potential. Still really good. Still less restricted than a lot of other... Well, actually, you know what? If we're talking about bad potentials, rogues are bad raps. Rogue also suffers from that, similar to how Bard does. Rogues tend to be players who are troublemakers, players who like pickpocketing. Rogues cause a lot of problems in a lot of games because they can do so many things. You know what? I'll drop the roleplay to A+, which does mean so that is A, S, A+. I think that puts Rogue... That actually downgrades Rogue. Yeah, I talked myself out of it. I think that fits. I feel like that fits. I think you could argue either way. But I feel like... No, you know what? Because I think I did something similar with Exemplar. Because of its story potential. Yeah. Yeah. That feels good. I keep making dicks. I don't know how I keep doing this. That feels good. I think that yeah. Low S for sure. Rogue gets a bad rep for sure, but I will say you can do more interesting things, and the various themes I think make you want to play differently. So even though its bad rep does reduce that score in particular, it's like an A+, an S, and a A-, or not A-. A+. Yeah, 2 A+. Yeah, that feels right. That feels good. All right. Sorcerer. Sorcerer is very interesting. Another very potent class. I don't think it's nearly as potent as a spellcaster as the Oracle, but I will say that with the ability to choose its spell list, that gives it an edge over Oracle overall. So I'm going to say A. It does what a lot of casters do with the ability to like pump their damage a little bit and be a little bit more potent in that way. But because it can choose its spell list, that actually gives it a pretty huge advantage over a lot of other spellcasters. So overall, I'm going to say A for that. Very solid A. Exploration. Same thing, actually. A. You can, based on your spell list, be either really, really good in exploration by having like the arcane spell list that can do almost anything, or you could be kind of bad with divine spells, which have gotten better. Don't get me wrong, divine spells have gotten better. but they are very much more orientated towards things that are not necessarily focused on boosts for out of combat stuff. So I think A, again, just very solid. Roleplay wise, though, I think this is very similar to Exemplar. It's kind of like proto-Exemplar. A sorcerer is special by blood. They are literally born better, and they just know magic intuitively. Also, a playstyle of magic that a lot of people just prefer more over prepared casting, I think goes a long way. But your blood and the fact that you can do blood evolutions to mix your blood with other types of bloodlines or spell casting types, there's a lot of really, really cool, like, as far as magic casters are concerned, I think roleplay-wise, Sorcerer is one of the most interesting just at base. It's so flexible. It's just there ripe for making a very interesting character. So I'm going to say that's S. So I think that's going to put Sorcerer right above Exemplar. Because Exemplar, I felt like was B. B, S, A, which I think would technically make an A. Or not B, S, A. It was A, B, S. Or maybe it was AAS. I don't remember. I think though, Exemplar being bottom of S makes the lot of sense. And Sorcerer, I think, is just a little bit more oomph than Exemplar, having a lot of some of the same benefits, though being much more focused as like a caster. I think this makes it really, really good. So AAS, bottom of S tier. You could also argue top of A tier. Well, let's see, because Barbarian was. Yeah, Barbarian was SAB. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I should have written this all out, but I like to do this kind of on the fly because I feel like when I talk my thoughts out, it makes a lot more sense than when I'm writing them. Summoner. All right, so this one I think will be a little controversial because genuinely, I think Summoner's really, really good in combat. Its action compression is insane, allowing you to do a lot of really good things. And mix into all that, you're playing essentially a martial and spellcaster. Though unlike Magus, you get to be in two places at once. And you can be positioned as a caster and as a martial at the same time. All the synergies, all the different ways that Eidolons can be used in combat make them very, very effective. And because, like, unlike a martial, the summoner can cast a spell and attack with just 2 actions, like a Magus, only less required for, like, the single hit. Magus needs to hit or it does nothing. The summoner can just use a spell and strike, and they're both not dependent on each other. And they still have an action left over, and they don't have a reload like the Magus does. So I think overall, Summoner is like S-. It's really good. I don't think it has the single target damage of a lot of classes. I don't think it has the potentially staying potential. Not quite, but very close. But with just the action compression alone, they just get to do more in combat than a lot of other characters do. Especially if they go Mounted Island, because Mounted Island just combines a lot of extra benefits as well. So I think S-. I legitimately do. I think you could argue A+, but S- is definitely where I'm putting them. Exploration mode. They run into a lot of the same kind of problems that Magus does. Limited spell pool, and they do get to choose their spell list. So they can be good in exploration mode, or they can kind of be bad in exploration mode, depending on what spell list they choose. Also, depending on their island's evolutions, they may have like movement options, or they may not. And while some of the islands can like change that up, and that can be somewhat a flexible part of the class, I'm gonna say overall that a summoner is not that different than a Magus. So I'm gonna say B. B, because they just don't have the same like amount as spellcasters do. And also, unless you pick one particular feat, you share the same skill proficiencies as your Eidolon. So even though you're a charisma caster, if you want your Eidolon to have really good athletics to do maneuvers, you have to invest in athletics, which can be really rough. And like I said, there's a feat that you can get around this, but that means you have to take that feat if you want to get around it. So yeah, I think B overall for exploration, which is interesting, to say the least. Not what I was expecting, but it makes a lot of sense. Now, role play. There's a lot of things. The bond of your island, the fact that the class, unlike something like the ranger that can choose an animal companion, also like Druid, you just have someone else. There's two characters. There's some connection that can be made. That's very huge. And you get to choose your spell list. So what kind of summoner, how you made the contract can vary differently. You could be a half-bit caster who's made a deal with an arcane being to make up for your weaknesses since you're not that good at casting. Maybe you have a divine envoy sent to protect you, which is also really cool. There's a lot of different islands that can make for very different stories. The different spell lists you can use, just the sheer number of different islands. It's very good. So I'm going to say S overall for Summoner as well for its roleplay potential. They just have a lot of different options. And unlike something like the Cleric that also has a lot of options, the nature of that bond isn't specifically restricted, which I think is important to mention. So we have S minus, B, and S. This does put it in the S category. And I'm going to say that puts it above because Rogue had, yeah, that makes sense. Being similar to Magus in a lot of ways. Not quite the cool factor, so I'll definitely put Magus a bit above, but still a really powerful and potent class overall. So overall, really, really good. All right. Swashbuckler. Interesting class. I'll say as far as a martial class is concerned, Swashbuckler doesn't have the same oomph that a rogue does, but a lot of the same skill proficiency. In fact, being one of the best, has a combat skill-based action classes in the game. And with the changes to Panache, they definitely feel a lot better. They're very competent in combat, but I will say, because Panache and a lot of Panache stuff is very dependent on what kind of saves the enemy is good at, and if the enemy even takes precision damage anyway, I think this makes Swashbuckler one of the more vulnerable. It's a really good class, don't get me wrong. In combat, I feel like it gets the job done, but I don't feel like it does so as well as some of the other classes. Not having the same damage potentials, I feel like even in classes like Investigator has, and just being a class that's really, really good at intermixing different maneuvers to make enemies weak. They're a really good attacker debuffer, but so are spellcasters. So I'm going to say B, strange. For all the martials, they've all scored pretty well, except for Swashbuckler. That's kind of sad. I don't think it's a bad class. I don't even think it's a bad class necessarily in combat. I think it definitely has a role, but if we're looking at Pathfinder as a game, I feel like it doesn't do it as well as mechanically some of the other ones get to do. And also being relegated to being a dex class typically because they want an agile or finesse weapon does also hurt some of its upper damage potentials. Panache just makes the difference, which is good, but that's a feature that's fighting to be even, not fighting to push ahead, which is a distinct difference. So B, yeah. Exploration. They are a skill monkey class, not quite as much as Investigator or Rogue, but more so than a lot of other classes. I would say even more so than an Inventor. But they are a martial class through and through. They're definitely going to have a lot more skills based on, especially because they want to have a good tumble through for getting Panache. The extra bonus, I feel like, makes it where they can be more flexible. So, yeah, I will say more so than martials in general. I'll say A. They can do a lot more things generally. They have more skill choices, I feel like. And they're really, really good at the skills. Funny enough, a Swashbuckler is probably going to be one of the best grapplers in the game. Best disarmers, really good at a lot of different things. And with the different styles, I feel like you could play very different types of Swashbucklers. So yeah, I think solid A in overall when it comes to exploration. Roleplay. This is a very interesting thing. It has a lot more personality than a lot of other martials do. It definitely feels like the Swashbuckler. You are playing a character who is all personality and has the skills to kind of back that up. And I think that's really cool. I think that's really fun. Swashbucklers just tend to make more fun and interesting characters. And with the different styles, there's a lot of different ways you could play, though a lot of people just go Gymnast because Gymnast is just really, really powerful. But I think there's a lot of different ways you could play Swashbuckler, and your character's just going to be interesting. The class just oozes charisma, and that's, I think, very, very potent. So I'm going to say A as well. A+, honestly. Compared to other martials, A+. So B in combat, A and A+, I think puts Swashbuckler in the... Yes. I feel that. I feel the Swashbuckler goes there. Because Inventor was B or like A+. Was it A+? I think it was A+. Or B+. I think it's B+. Yeah. But it was also reluctantly A in exploration and A in overall combat. So yeah, I think that's where Swashbuckler goes. It definitely doesn't compare to the other classes that have very strong S tier qualities, mostly all of them in combat, I'm noticing. But I think it's really, really good, especially because, like, yeah, I think it's overall good. I think, honestly, these three are pretty intermixable, if I'm going to be honest. But I feel like this is the vibe. I think Swashbuckler goes there. All right. Over 2 hours now. Oh, goodness. What a long video. Thaumaturge. I love Thaumaturge. I love Monster Hunters. I think they're very interesting. It's very weird that we now have a lot more Monster Hunter S classes with Divine Mysteries and with War of Immortals coming out. But I think Thaumaturge is a very unique class that operates in very interesting ways. So, overall, Thaumaturge in combat, pretty good. Being able to just create a weakness on any enemy is really good, though they have a little bit of a slow startup compared to some of the other classes. And not all of their playstyles are inherently very combat-y, if I'm being honest. Like, some of them are. The weapon implement, I think, is genuinely really, really good and can make you as accurate as a fighter with just extra action economy mixed in. I think that's really, really good. But I feel like a lot of its other stuff makes it where the Thaumaturge is really good when you have enemies who have weaknesses. Otherwise, their ability to, well, one, be able to boost any one-handed weapon. Like, they make a one-handed weapon do as much damage as a good or like a moderate tier two-handed weapon, which is very solid, honestly, which gives them a lot of interesting weapon potentials as well. But their class doesn't have a lot of strike-based feats. It doesn't have area potential, and a lot of casters just can hit a lot of different enemy weaknesses as well, though no one is as good as exploiting weaknesses as a Thaumaturge. And there's a lot of good weaknesses of creatures in the game. So I think Thaumaturge ranks very firmly like A- in combat. Not quite so bad, but unlike Swashbuckler, it never has to worry about its main damage like gimmick ever being immune. If anything, it's always going to be a weakness, which I think is very potent. So definitely A-, A- to A. Exploration. Oh, you know what? Also, Thaumaturge in combat, really, really good at recall knowledge, which is very powerful in combat. So actually, I'm going to boost their combat to A to A+. I think just how good they are at recalling knowledge on creatures is really good. And that is a very important thing that can help strategy-wise, though not necessarily at every table. Exploration-wise, because it's a charisma-based class, it's really good at facing, or can be. And it's a class that can have amazing, like, it can have S-tier quality of exploration benefits. because it can do things like recall knowledge on a lot of different things. The regalia is very good at helping your teammates do things. It helps your whole team with skill checks. Insanely powerful. And with the book, the tome implement, you can do some really, like, you can get skill proficiencies in a lot of different things. It really depends on what implements you're picking and when you are picking them. So I'm going to say very solidly A, because they are very, very good potentially at skills, but that can range from like B plus to S minus. So I'm going to say A overall. Roleplay wise, I think they are ripe for roleplay. The different implements can have some kind of tie, some kind of story. It can be very interesting. They are very intriguing characters, though I will say one of the things about the Thaumaturge is their implement becomes a very heavy part of their character because they can oftentimes do really good things. The tome, for instance, you're always going to have your book out, which can be good, but your character always kind of becomes associated with that item if you pick it. So some of the implements kind of make your character just have a very specific vibe because you're always using said item. It becomes a part of your character, your idea. And it's not necessarily like as tool based as I think the Paizo wanted you to think it is, because you just have one super good tool and then a lot of other really cool tools. But it's a fun class. I think it overall has some of the most interesting potential, lots of interesting stories. I think it has a lot of very cool things, and you can just do some really cool things with it. Though I feel like when you compare it to, say, like the other S tiers when it comes to roleplay stuff, it doesn't quite hit the same level. So I'm going to say overall A+. A+ roleplay. Very, very good, but definitely is not like S tier roleplay. It's just very solid overall. So with a solid A for combat, a very solid A for exploration, and A for roleplay, that just puts them in a very solid place in A. So I'm going to say probably right above Swashbuckler. It just bounces out. It's just super A to A+. Very, very good. Thaumaturge is very, very good without some of the weaknesses that, say, Swashbuckler has. So I think that's very fitting. Last two. All right. If I have not earned your sub at this point, give it to me now. I need it. I need it to get through. All right. Witch. Witch is, it's got some really interesting things for combat, but I don't think it does anything super special. Its biggest benefit is it can choose what spell tradition it uses. So it could use something like Primal, which is very, very good in combat. It could heal. You could do all kinds of stuff, which has the potential to be really good or kind of okay. So I'm going to say overall, it's going to be A to A-, depending on the list. I don't think it does anything unique, like some of the familiar stuff. And to be fair, there is one familiar thing that's super broken that can just make an enemy slowed forever, which is really, really good, but that's a very niche case. And the other familiar stuff, while interesting, I don't think are nearly as like potent as, say, like a Barbarian or a Cleric. So I'm going to say A, solid A overall for combat. Exploration. It's based on its spell list. It's either going to be okay to like really, really good because it's arcane. And arcane is just very good in exploration mode because there's almost nothing it can't do. So I'm going to say another solid A. And finally, roleplay. The Witch is this is Paizo's version of the Warlock when it comes to that. You got some patron, you got some power, especially with the new Seneschal class archetype. I think there's a lot of very interesting stories you can play. Plus, you have a familiar, automatically have a familiar. That's an extra character for interactions. I think it's a very easy S tier. Like, not a special S tier, but definitely a very special S tier when it comes to overall its capabilities. So that's AAS. Not anything special, I think, in any one category. And even roleplay wise, I think it's good because it offers it like the class gives you so much. The origin of your power, like there's a lot of really, really good things. So I'm gonna say which overall joins the upper A echelon, where like all 4 of these are pretty intermixable. You could swap any one of these and I feel like you'd be overall good. I think maybe Barbarian, just because in combat it can do multiple things, where a lot of these are just good at kind of one thing in combat, except for which just is really, really good when it comes to its narrative aspects. I would say more so than the other ones. So yeah. I think I'm very confident with that. All right, finally, Wizard. Wizard is also very interesting. So, the only, I think, are they not? No, well, technically Magus as well. But the only real pure arcane spellcaster, which is interesting. I guess Druid is technically the only pure primal. Yeah. Huh. Interesting, yeah. So, Wizard is really good in combat. Arcane spell list is solid. It can be very versatile. It is not as blasty necessarily as primal, but pretty close in a lot of ways. They can do a lot of things in combat. They can do, like, I think the arcane spell list is overall, I want to say like an S tier combat list. It's just, it offers so much. But I think I'm going to temper back a little bit. I'm going to say A+. The arcane spell list is really good, but if you don't have a lot of enemies, the wizard is purely just either a buffer or a debuffer, and it does both in equal measures, where like a cleric is just good because it can heal, and it's not like, it doesn't have the same potential. So I'm going to say A+ in combat. Exploration, S. The arcane spell list is unmatched because it can do anything. You want to create a thing, you want to create an illusion, you want to give mobility. It's known as the largest spell list, and while Paizo is making some effort to change that, it is the largest spell list, and the wizard specifically is the one who is able to make the most use out of it, because unlike Sorcerer that has a more restricted repertoire, the wizard gets the ability to change what spells it uses. And Cleric can do something similar, but it was S in combat by grace of having healing font. Wizard has the same potential, though it has more utility than, say, Primal Magic does with the Druid. So yeah, S for exploration. Wizard can just do anything. Wizards are problem solvers, and they always have a spell for every occasion. That's just kind of the theme of the class. Now, roleplay. The class has a little baggage because magic casters and wizards and a lot of like media portrays magic casters as someone who's like, I can do magic. This is kind of cool. In olden times, you were like an old man, and it's a class that's been slowly evolving, but so many classes can just use magic now. Like, what made Wizard special in the past was that it was the best magic caster. It was the class for magic casting. But as fantasy games have kind of gone and grown, Wizard just being all about magic isn't anything really super special. I mean, a sorcerer can be super into magic and is born with special blood, where a wizard is just learning from spellbooks. I do think the whole learning from spellbooks creates interesting story. Don't get me wrong. I think that's really cool. I love adding to a spell list, but I wish Paizo gamified adding to your spell list more rather than just giving you more options. I wish your spellbook was more of a special item that did more something unique. And maybe one day we'll get that, but that's not today. So I think overall, because of the schools and because of the kind of reasons why your character can get into magic and being an explorer, I think it's a very solid A, which means Wizard gets A+, S, and A, putting it, I think, right above all these, because Barbarian, really, really good in combat, not good with exploration. Ranger, really, really good in combat. Pretty good at exploration. Roleplay-wise, is kind of okay. Cleric, insanely good for healing and is like a keystone member of any party, but it gets locked into certain edicts and you have to play very specific ways for roleplay, and having just not a super great list for exploration purposes, I think puts Wizard very firmly at the top of A. So this is my lists. This is my objective list. All right, so I'm going to do a little bit of editing here in a moment, but I want to kind of discuss now that we're done, because this is slightly different than my list was before. So my list before, which I'll show here, doesn't have any S's, has a couple C's, Alchemist being one of them, and a lot of this was, I think, created by my hesitance to bring any class to S, because I don't want people to be like, oh, this is just objectively better than the other classes. And it's not a vibe I wanted to give off. But also no C's, because honestly, Alchemist is just way more accessible than it used to be. In Gunslinger, now that I've looked into Gunslinger a lot more, I feel like I understand more of its purpose. And so it doesn't feel like fighter, but more specific. And it has a lot of really cool feats and some interesting features that give it some oomph that fighter doesn't. So this is my objective list. This is the list of, if you're getting into Paizo. If you're getting into Pathfinder 2nd edition and you're thinking like, okay, if I'm going into a very general experience, if this game I'm going into has equal amounts of exploration, combat, and narrative, then this, I think, list is very accurate. The classes at the top, the S tier ones, are pretty good. Like, they're insanely good at 2 of those categories more often than not, and lack in one of the other ones. The A tiers have probably 1 S tier or are just very consistently good. And the B tiers kind of suffer mostly from, most of the B tier we can see here are just classes that are really, really good in combat and kind of suck at everything else. So, this is not by any means a list to tell you what you should play, because your game is going to be different in the 3 categories. If you're playing a lot of combat, I guarantee fighter and Oracle and Champion, like those classes, are not Oracle, sorry, Psychic, are definitely going to jump up. Like fighter, if you have a very combat heavy class, fighter's weight goes way up and it becomes much, much more valuable. And if you have a class that's very roleplay heavy, classes like Barbarian or Ranger might suffer depending on how good of a role player you are. Like, that's the thing. Like, this is what the classes give you. If you're a really good role player, then all these could be S tier role play. But not everyone is a good role player. That's the thing. So if you want a character that's just interesting, then a Sorcerer and Exemplar are, for instance, inherently interesting, while a fighter isn't inherently interesting. It's very vanilla as far as classes are concerned. And as far as exploration, I think there's not really a game that's mostly exploration. But if you have a more roleplay based game, you're going to be doing a lot more skill checks typically, which is going to bring a lot more value to those kind of classes. So something like the Swashbuckler actually gets a lot more value in a more roleplay based game because you're probably doing a lot more skill checks, similar to Inventor. So this is my list, being as objective and unbiased as possible. Whether you agree or disagree, that's fine, because this list isn't definitive for anyone. No one's game is very, not even my games. I talk about GMing a lot. Not even my games are perfectly balanced between the 3 different schools of tabletop, the 3 different pillars. I run my games a lot more narrative heavy, but but there's a lot of combat too. Like, I'm not missing combat or exploration. It's just there's more emphasis on the narrative, so more narrative things pay out better for the players than just being good at combat. you know what I mean? So, while my games are balanced as far as like overall what's doing, what's important to the story is very typically the narrative. So this is my lists that is for, you know, general play, for if all things are equal. But this is boring and very, very, like, look at it. Look at all the A's. Everything is good in Pathfinder 2nd edition. So, you know, what's the point of making any choices when anything is good? I'm going to give you guys my list on what I feel, what my vibes are for the most interesting classes. All right, I've adjusted my list, and I know a lot of people are going to be very angry, but this is my list of the classes I think have the most to offer to least to offer. Kineticist, I was not lying. You can play any kind of character. It's really, really good. I think Kineticist objectively is just one of the best classes in the game. It's super fun. Investigator is still at the top. Still one of my favorite classes. In fact, I think I'm going to adjust my list just a little bit. Yeah, at least here. Inventor, though, I love Inventor. I think that the different innovations are so fascinating. I think, genuinely speaking, Inventor is really, really fun. I have a lot of fun with Inventor. And I think all the skill proficiencies and the different ways you can, the fact that you can change your innovations day to day can alter how you play. So as an overall experience, I think Inventor is really fun. Investigator, you can kind of just do anything with, and the fact that they now added the Palatine Detective means that you can even be a magic detective now, which I think is really good. Monk is because I like punching people. Also, I think monks are just really good. The ability that they have so many good movement options, so many good ways of just punching people, so many interesting ways they can use styles. I think they're really powerful. Summoner's action compression is insanely good, and I've honestly been really wanting to play a summoner. I've been having my players in my games, or players I've been playing with, had been using summoners, and they're really interesting. And so I think that they'd be really cool to play. I played one in a one-shot, and that was a lot of fun, which I think has a lot of potential. I am so interested to play the Seneschal. That's kind of what's putting Witch up here in S tier for me at the moment. The Seneschal just looks insanely fun and like perfectly my play style. Also, Witch is, I think, genuinely really good. The Familiar makes for more intriguing, interesting mechanic play styles, which I think are really cool. And you can tell some really cool stories with Witch. A didn't really change a whole bunch. Ranger dropped, I think. Where'd Ranger go? Yeah, Ranger dropped mostly because I think Ranger is good, but I feel like compared to a lot of the other classes, I've just been less interested in playing Ranger. And if I was to say something notable about Ranger, it's mostly Flurry for its edges. The other edges are kind of okay, but Flurry is the one that stands out the most because it's just so good. I would play Witch. Witch honestly is my play style as well. Barbarian is just really good. I think like even though I wouldn't necessarily play a Barbarian, I feel like anyone could play a Barbarian and have a good time. So I think objectively it's just a really good class. Same thing for Cleric. Cleric just makes it where your party can make many more mistakes. And also just the act of exploring gods, I think, is really cool. So a lot of the same stipulations I was kind of having before are kind of removed. I would probably even move Cleric up to S, but I just don't feel like it's an S tier in my eyes. Same thing with Thaumaturge. Thaumaturge seems really cool on the surface, but in practice, you have to do a lot of setup to do some of its best things, and there's a lot of action economy used there. And mechanically speaking, they are very limited by the fact that they can only use like one-handed weapons, which is very sad. But you can do some really, really cool things. One of my favorite builds, you should check it out. It's the Archivist build on my channel. It makes Thaumaturge very, very interesting. Swashbuckler is got a lot of potential. I gotta say, I've been wanting to play a Devil May Cry style character, and Swashbuckler keeps calling out to me. I think you could make such a fun character, and it just looks like such a fun class. And I'll say in a more tactical combat setting, swashbucklers are invaluable because they can debuff enemies very, very well, making the rest of your team very strong. So if you have a good swashbuckler on your team, you can have a very, very confident team in strategy play. Like, the more strategic combat gets, the higher value swashbuckler gets, which makes it very powerful. That's the same thing, honestly, for Alchemist. Alchemist, if you gain a lot of system knowledge, is incredibly potent, but it does suffer from a little bit of action problems, and your versatile vials are very limiting. If you have combats in quick succession, some styles of Alchemist start suffering pretty heavily because you just can't keep up. Bomber, not so much, because you can use your versatile vials just as straight bombs, and you can just create vial, which is very handy. But if you're playing like a mutagenist or even a toxicologist, there's a lot more action problems that they run into, and they can suffer a lot. Narratively speaking, they are cool. I like big brainy classes, but I think they kind of suffer compared to some of the other classes. Sorcerer, very standardly just a good class in general. I don't really have any problems with it. I think it's just genuinely good. You want to play a magic caster that isn't a prepared spellcaster, Sorcerer is kind of like the de facto one, and your characters are just inherently interesting. Kind of same thing for Exemplar. Exemplar is probably even cooler. Like, if I was to adjust this list a little bit more, I think I'd do this. Yeah, I think I'd do this. I think Sorcerer and Exemplar are both super duper interesting. Exemplar has probably, actually, I probably put Exemplar above Sorcerer and probably even above Cleric. I guess it depends on how much you like healing. If you are a support main like I am, the heals are really, really good. Exemplar is just really good. I love building your story. I think it's super fun, super interesting. The weapons you get to use are really cool. Like, it's just a class that's exploding with flavor. That's why I like the Exemplar. Sorcerer, same, but to a somewhat lesser degree. But they're just a really good general caster, and one I recommend a lot of people try out if you want to try spellcasting at all. In this next category, which, by the way, S is like, I'm either going to play a character like this if I haven't already. A is, I would like to if the opportunity arises. B is, this is interesting, I'd like to try it. C is, I would have to get a very specific character idea to play these. And D is, well, one, I'll talk about Magus specifically, but D, mostly for fighter, is just I don't think I would have that much fun with this unless I had a very unique story idea for it. Otherwise, the class itself doesn't really give me anything. Anyway, B, Champion. Champion is so fun. Being super supportive, super tanky. You get to just be the most helpful and biggest nuisance on your team's side, which is really cool. Also, I am a sucker for like the Divine Crusader, like smite kind of builds, which you can't necessarily do that much with Champion in this system, I gotta admit. But there are some interesting Juggernaut Champion styles that I think are really cool. Animist is, I think, way back on this list. Actually, yeah. Ranger, I've always wanted to play a Ranger, honestly. I would definitely like to, but honestly, one of the things with Ranger is, it's a class that like I would like to try playing, but it doesn't call to me, which is very sad. I've always liked Ranger in the past, but it just doesn't call to me in 2nd edition, which is very sad. Bard is standardly really good. I think the cantrips are very interesting. You know, I don't know how much it is fun for me, but I would like that style of play, so that's kind of why it's here. And also, if you are new to the game and you want to try an interesting repertoire caster that's not Sorcerer, I think Bard's a very good runner-up. Rogue, I think, is just objectively good in so many ways. It's not necessarily for me, but it's so good in so many different kinds of games. You can just always pick a rogue and always be useful. Though I do have a problem with rogues because rogues just tend to be the most annoying players you get at your table. People want to play a little rapscallion, a little mischievous guy, and they oftentimes pick a rogue, which is a nightmare as a GM because they're really, really good at being mischievous, which can be really hard to keep them on track. So it's this low mostly just because of that for me, if I'm going to be honest. Gunslinger, I think, has a lot of fun potential. I think Gunslinger has some really cool feats and is also really cool. I think the only reason why you know what, I'm putting Gunslinger at the top of B here for me. The only reason why it's not an A for me at this moment is purely because I think it requires more of a conscious playstyle choice than a lot of people are capable of making. So, like, if this is a tier list of like the vibes I'm getting, I feel like Gunslinger is not just perfect for everyone. I think it's cool. It's very interesting. I think I like Gunslinger a lot. I just don't think it's for everyone. And while some of these here at the top are kind of just more based on my bias than anything, because like, if I'm gonna be honest, I think Investigator would probably be also like here if I was being honest and not overly, taken over by my preferences. But, I will leave it here for now. I think Gunslinger is just in that vibe of like, I think it's fun. I think it'd be very interesting, but not quite for everyone. And I know that. Psychic, genuinely good, but its lack of spell slots forces you to just constantly use your cantrips over and over again, which doesn't seem super interesting to me. Though those cantrips are very powerful, and I know it's very, very good for multi-classing, but this is not a multi-class spell list. I do think it's a very big miss on Paiza's part that psychics just don't work differently than a spellcaster. I feel like a kineticist makes a better psychic than psychic. In fact, I think a kineticist makes a better sorcerer than sorcerer. Kineticist is just objectively a powerful class because you get infinite spells that other classes wish they could have. Like, so, it's like, I could play a psychic, but I could get probably a lot more of what I want from kineticist, which is just a big blow to it. Druid, I think I just have a hard, I don't personally have a strong preference for it. It's another prepared spellcaster, which does make it a little bit harder for people to use. And unlike Cleric that has healing font, which can be just genuinely useful, I feel like you'd have to actually try to play Druid to be good. And, I feel like the monster shapes can be a trap for a lot of players because they're like, oh, I'm going to turn into a tiger and then be really good at martial combat and then not quite feel that way, sadly. And that's for balancing purposes because you are just a caster and you always are. But because of that, I feel like a lot of people might get like turned off of Druid just because it's not meeting their expectations. Oracle, very much the same. You're a divine caster and I feel like the curse is just very lacking. Some curses are so easy to work around that they're laughable that they even exist. And a lot of the fun jank of Oracle is now gone, which I really liked the jank personally. I think it's objectively a very powerful caster. And I feel like if a player picked it, I think you'd be doing good. But I feel like due to how advanced it is, the divine spell list and everything like that, if I compared it to, say, Bard, I feel like they're not as obviously useful to as many people. And so Oracle kind of ranks lower on top of just the fact that, honestly, I would have to have a very interesting idea for a character to pick Oracle. Animist. Animist is very similar in the same ways that Oracle is, honestly, in almost every way. I think the spirits are really cool. I've never been one to have like a bunch of characters talking to my character, though. So that's just a thing. I feel like also to make the most use out of Animist, it actually requires more advanced skill plays. So if a new player wanted to play an Animist, I'd be like, okay, but you're probably better off playing something like a Sorcerer or a Bard. I feel like their power is just a lot more accessible and Animist is a lot more complicated. I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot of cool things, but that's kind of what it is in the end. It's an interesting class and not like what I would say an obviously good class. I kind of talked about Fighter already. Fighter is just not a class I'm particularly that interested in. I think you can make a lot of cool characters with Fighter. And honestly, I would probably pick a Fighter maybe for some interesting character ideas just because that extra accuracy to their weapon allows them to have a lot of interesting stat distributions because you can actually downplay like your your strength or your dex, making you on par with other martials while still having like a lot of the same strikes and all the good things that make fighter fighter. But you could do a lot of interesting things. My friend played a really interesting, like intelligence-based fighter that was really good, who is really good at reading enemies, had all kinds of recall knowledge actions, and was overall like a good investigative character as well. I thought his fighter was really cool, and that's what makes me think fighter has some interesting potential. Magus, I want to like Magus. I really do. I don't even think it's necessarily this bad, but this is where I'm putting it based on vibes. Because honestly, Magus's playstyle is so strict, so rigid. And yeah, I've been told many, many, many times, you don't have to use Spell Strike as a Magus. You can choose not to. Yeah, I tried that. I legitimately did. But like a lot of the combats in many of the modules are not that big and last 1 to 2 rounds, or like 1 to 3 rounds, honestly. Sometimes I got to act 2 times in a combat. So a lot of the interesting ways you can play Magus doing some setup are not very valid in a lot of like the campaigns, unless you're just in very big battles. I feel like if a lot of the Adventure Pass had much bigger, longer battles, Magus would be a much more interesting class because it has the ability to amp itself in a way that a lot of other classes don't. But because a lot of the battles are short, Magus felt pretty boring, honestly. I wanted to do so much. I felt like I was constantly banging against the cage, like wanting to be let out, like, let me do the cool things. But the battle would end. Or, you know, there just wasn't a moment where I could do something where I couldn't just use... I couldn't just use Spell Strike, even with a cantrip, and be overall more effective. So in a game where you have very limited turns, Magus, I feel, feels the worst. And that's why it's all the way down here at the bottom, the very, very end of my list. So yeah, this is my vibe list. This is my preferences, what I think people generally work with, not objectively speaking, and not based on, this one is more based on accessibility and more based on vibe than my other one, which is more just like as factual, but not too factual as possible. I don't know. I'm sure you all let me know your thoughts down below, but hey, I'm glad I finally got to do this video. I think it was a lot of fun. And if you've stuck with it for all this time, put the word banana down in the comments. I'm very curious to see how many people are going to watch all the way to the end of my rambly mess here. So say the word banana and maybe we'll weird some people out in the comments. I don't know. Anyway, that's it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. I'm going to go rest my voice now. Bye-bye.